Hello, travelers of the night, and welcome back to Midnight Lullaby. These stories drift through the static, a signal that drowns out the noise of the waking world and guides you into slumber. Before the signal slips away, leave a trace. Tell me which part of the world you're listening from, so I know how far this broadcast reaches. And if the whispers keep you company, a like and a subscribe help keep the transmission alive. Now, close your eyes, relax. The broadcast begins. The steam tables have been empty since 9 o'clock. I know because I cleaned them myself, scraping away the last traces of meatloaf and green beans, wiping down the stainless steel until it gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The Riverside Medical Center cafeteria closes to the public at 8:30, and by 9, everything should be spotless, empty, ready for tomorrow's breakfast shift. But that's not how it works anymore. My name is Janet, and I've been working the night shift here for 6 months now. Security hired me to keep an eye on the building after hours, to make sure the doors are locked and the ovens are off and nothing walks away that shouldn't. It's quiet work, mostly. The kind of job that lets you read a book or catch up on your phone while the building settles around you like an old dog finding a comfortable spot. At least, that's what I thought when I took the position. The hospital never sleeps, of course. There are always doctors making rounds, nurses checking on patients, orderlies pushing wheelchairs down the endless corridors. But the cafeteria is supposed to be different. The cafeteria is supposed to be mine from 9 p.m. until 6 a.m. 9 hours of solitude in a space that smells like industrial disinfectant and the ghosts of 1,000 meals. The first time it happened, I blamed exhaustion. Night shifts mess with your circadian rhythm, make you see things that aren't there, hear sounds that have no source. I'd been walking my rounds at 12:15 a.m., checking that all the food service areas were secure, when I smelled something cooking. Not the lingering odor of the day's menu. That fades by 11, absorbed by the ventilation system and the natural hunger of an empty space. This was active cooking, fresh onions hitting hot oil, the deep, rich scent of something braising low and slow, garlic and herbs I couldn't identify, spices that made my mouth water despite the fact that I'd eaten dinner before my shift. I followed the smell to the serving area, where the steam tables sit in their neat row like silver soldiers. The lights were off. I always turn them off during my first rounds. But I could see steam rising from the center station. Not the wispy vapor of cooling metal, but thick, purposeful steam. The kind that comes from food kept at exactly the right temperature. I flipped the switch, and the serving area blazed to life under the heat lamps. The steam table was full. Not full of the day's leftovers, but full of dishes I'd never seen before. In the first compartment, a stew of some kind, dark and aromatic, with chunks of what looked like beef, but smelled like something richer, more complex. The second held a grain I didn't recognize. Not rice, not quinoa, but something that gleamed like tiny pearls and gave off a nutty fragrance that made my stomach growl. The third compartment was the strangest. A soup clear as glass but somehow substantial, with delicate floating elements that might have been flowers or might have been something else entirely. When I leaned closer to examine them, they seemed to pulse gently, like jellyfish in a calm sea. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the impossible smells, watching steam rise from food that shouldn't exist. The logical part of my mind insisted this was a mistake, some mix-up with the day shift. A catering order that had arrived late, a prank by one of the kitchen staff who had a key and too much time on their hands. But the food was too strange for any of those explanations. Too carefully prepared, too perfectly seasoned, too completely foreign to anything I'd ever encountered in my 15 years of food service work. I touched the side of the serving pan with one finger. It was exactly the right temperature. Hot enough to keep the food safe, not so hot as to overcook it. Professional. Perfect. When I looked up from the steam table, a man was standing at the entrance to the serving area. He was elderly, maybe 70, wearing clothes that looked expensive, but somehow timeless. A wool coat despite the warmth of the kitchen, leather gloves, a scarf that might have been cashmere. His hair was silver, white and perfectly combed, and his eyes held the kind of kindness you see in grandparents and old teachers. "Excuse me," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The cafeteria is closed. You can't be in here." He smiled, and his whole face crinkled with genuine warmth. "I know, dear. I'm not here for the regular menu." He gestured toward the steam table with one gloved hand. "I'm here for this. I don't understand. Who prepared this food? How did you get into the building?" But even as I asked, I realized I couldn't hear his footsteps on the tile floor. Couldn't hear him breathing. The only sounds in the cafeteria were the hum of the refrigeration units and the soft bubbling of the mysterious stew. "May I?" he asked, indicating the serving spoons. I should have said no. Should have called security or the police, or someone with authority to handle impossible situations. Instead, I found myself nodding, watching as he served himself a portion of each dish onto a plain white cafeteria plate. He found a table in the seating area, one of the round ones by the windows, where the night shift nurses sometimes sit when they grab a quick meal. I watched him eat with the careful attention of someone who had been hungry for a very long time. Not physically hungry, but hungry in some deeper way. Hungry for connection, for warmth, for the particular comfort that comes from sharing food with others. When he finished, he brought his plate back to the dish return window, rinsed it carefully in the sink, and placed it in the rack with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of a lifetime of cleaning up after himself. "Thank you," he said, and his voice carried echoes of gratitude that went far deeper than appreciation for a simple meal. Then he walked toward the exit, and I realized I could see the tables through his body, the chairs, the walls beyond. He was fading as he moved, becoming transparent, becoming memory. At the doorway, he turned back. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. I nodded before I could stop myself. When I looked back at the steam table, it was empty again, clean, the surfaces cool to the touch, as if they'd been sitting unused for hours. But the smell lingered, those rich, complex aromas that had no name, clinging to the air like the ghost of an extraordinary meal. That was 2 months ago. Since then, they come every night. Not just the man in the wool coat, though he's always first, arriving at 12:15 with the punctuality of someone who has learned to value time in a way the living rarely do. He's followed by others. A young woman in a nurse's uniform from the 1960s, her hair in a perfect beehive, her shoes silent on the tile floor. he a construction worker still covered in the dust of projects completed decades ago. Children in clothes that span the centuries, their faces bright with the particular hunger that only the young possess. They come, and the steam table fills itself. Every night, different dishes. Foods from cultures I can't identify, prepared with techniques I've never seen. Seasoned with spices that seem to carry the memory of distant places and forgotten times. The clear soup appears regularly, but the floating elements are never quite the same. Sometimes like tiny stars, sometimes like miniature flowers, once like small fish that swam slowly the broth as if it were their natural habitat. I've learned not to question it, not to call security or report the impossible to supervisors who would never believe me. Instead, I've become the midnight hostess of this strange cafeteria, ensuring the plates are clean, the napkin dispensers full, the tables wiped down for guests who shouldn't exist but somehow do. They're always polite, always grateful. They bus their own tables, wash their own dishes, leave no trace, except the lingering sense of their impossible meals. And they never speak to each other, only to me. Brief words of thanks, gentle smiles, the kind of acknowledgement you give to someone who has provided something essential. Last week, the young nurse approached me after finishing what looked like a delicate fish prepared with herbs that glowed faintly in the dark. "You've been very kind," she said, her voice carrying the same echo as all their voices, as if it were reaching me from the bottom of a well. "I don't understand what's happening," I told her. "I don't understand who you are or where this food comes from." She tilted her head, considering. "Does it matter? I think it should." "Well, we're all here," she said. "In life, this hospital, this building. We worked here, were treated here, said goodbye here. And when it was time to go, we found we couldn't quite leave." She gestured toward the steam table. "We're a family. Parents and 3 children in clothes from the 1940s. Were serving themselves what appeared to be a holiday feast despite the fact that it was the middle of July. Food is memory," the nurse continued. "Food is comfort. Food is the thing that makes us human, connects us to each other, to our homes, to our hearts. We come here not because we're hungry for sustenance, but because we're hungry for connection." "But why me? Why can I see you when others can't?" She smiled, the same warm expression I'd seen on all their faces. "Because you're kind. Because you feed people, and that's a sacred act. Because when we needed someone to understand, you were here, and you didn't run away." I looked around the cafeteria, at the impossible diners eating impossible food, at the steam table that defied every law of physics and logic I'd ever learned. "What happens if I leave? If I quit this job?" "Then you leave," she said simply. "And we'll wait for the next person who can see us, who can understand what we need." How long have you been waiting? Time works differently for us. Sometimes it feels like yesterday we were alive. Sometimes it feels like centuries. But the hunger remains constant, not for food, but for the experience of sharing a meal, of being part of something larger than ourselves. She returned to her table, and I watched her finish her glowing fish in small, delicate bites. Each one savored like it was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. Tonight feels different, though. Tonight, as I make my rounds at 12:10, preparing for the nightly gathering, I notice something new. there's an extra place setting at the table by the windows. The round table where the man in the wool coat always sits alone, eating his mysterious stew with the careful attention of someone making each bite last. But tonight there are 2 plates, 2 sets of silverware, 2 napkins folded with the precise geometry of professional food service. He arrives at 12:15, as always, but tonight he's not alone. The woman with him looks familiar, though I know I've never seen her before. She has the same silver hair, the same kind eyes, the same quality of fading around the edges that marks all my midnight diners. She wears a dress from the 1950s, blue with tiny white flowers, and when she looks at me, her smile contains decades of love. My wife, the man explains as they approach the steam table together. She finally found her way here. Tonight's offerings are different too, more elaborate, more festive. The stew has been joined by what looks like a roast of some kind, perfectly browned and glistening with juices that smell like Sunday dinner and childhood memories. There are vegetables I recognize, carrots and potatoes and onions, but they seem more vivid than vegetables should be, more essentially themselves. And in the center compartment, a cake, tall and white and decorated with flowers that might be made of frosting or might be real blossoms preserved in sugar. It glows with a soft, warm light, like candles, like celebration, like joy made edible. The man and woman serve themselves together, their movements synchronized by a lifetime of shared meals, shared responsibilities, shared love. They sit at their table by the windows, and for the first time since I've been watching these midnight dinners, I hear conversation. Not the words. Those are too soft, too distant, carried away by the echoes of the empty cafeteria. But the rhythm of it, the gentle back and forth of 2 people who know each other completely, the sound of companionship, of belonging, of home. Other diners arrive and serve themselves from the feast. The young nurse, the construction worker, the family from the 1940s, children from various decades, elderly men and women whose clothes span the century. But they all give the couple space. All seem to understand that tonight is special. When the man and woman finish their meal, they approach me together. "Thank you," the woman says, her voice carrying the same well-water echo as all the others. For taking care of him these past months, for taking care of all of us. I don't understand what I'm doing, I admit. I just let you eat. "You do much more than that," the man says. "You witness us. You acknowledge us. You make space for our need to be human, even when we're no longer quite alive." The woman reaches out as if to touch my hand, but stops just short, her fingers hovering over mine. I can feel the warmth, though, or the memory of warmth. "We won't be back," she says gently. "You're leaving. We're going together," the man explains. That's all we needed, to share one more meal, to remember what it felt like to be together. Now we can let go. They walk toward the exit hand in hand, and I watch them fade like the others always do, becoming transparent, becoming memory, becoming part of the building's strange history. But this time, they don't disappear completely. This time, I can still see the faintest outline of them in the doorway. 2 shadows holding each other, 2 spirits finding peace. Will the others stay? I ask. The woman turns back, almost completely invisible now. As long as they need to. As long as someone is here to see them. They vanish, and the cafeteria returns to its normal midnight stillness. The steam table is empty again, clean and cold. But on the table by the windows, someone has left a single white flower. Real or made of sugar, I can't tell. It glows with that same soft light as the cake, and when I pick it up, it smells like joy. I put it in a small vase and place it on the counter where I sit during my shifts. Tomorrow night, the others will return. The nurse, the construction worker, the families and children and elderly diners who need the comfort of shared food, shared space, shared acknowledgement of their continued existence. And I'll be here, making sure the plates are clean and the tables are ready, serving as witness to their hunger and their humanity. Outside the cafeteria windows, the city sleeps fitfully under streetlights and neon signs. Inside, the refrigeration units hum their mechanical lullaby, and somewhere in the walls, the building holds its breath, waiting for tomorrow night's impossible feast. I check my watch, 24/7 a.m., still hours until dawn, until the day shift arrives to prepare breakfast for the living. Still hours of solitude, with only the flower for company, glowing softly in its vase like a small star fallen to earth. But I'm not alone, really. I'm part of something now, a strange communion that bridges the gap between life and whatever comes after. A midnight congregation that gathers not for worship, but for the simple, essential act of sharing food. Tomorrow night, they'll come again, and I'll be ready with clean plates and an open heart to help them remember what it means to be human. The flower pulses gently in its vase, like a slow heartbeat, like the rhythm of breathing, like the eternal cycle of hunger and satisfaction that connects us all. In the steam table's polished surface, I catch a glimpse of my own reflection. For just a moment, I look different, softer around the edges, more translucent, as if spending so much time with ghosts has begun to change me too. But I'm not afraid. When my time comes, years from now, decades from now, I think I know where I'll want to spend eternity. In a warm kitchen, surrounded by the sounds and smells of cooking, serving food to anyone who's hungry. Because feeding people is a sacred act, and some hungers are too important to let death interfere with. Story 2. The GPS first glitched on Highway 61, somewhere between Memphis and nowhere in particular. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, hauling electronics from Tennessee to Oklahoma City, when the familiar female voice that had guided me through countless miles suddenly stuttered. Turn left on. In 500 feet, turn left on. Continue straight for. I reached over and tapped the screen, thinking maybe the mounting bracket had come loose again. The device flickered, went dark for a moment, then illuminated with that soft blue glow I knew so well. The mechanical voice resumed, smooth and confident. Continue on Highway 61 for 12 miles. I settled back into my seat, feeling the familiar ache in my lower back that came with long hauls. The radio murmured softly. Some late night talk show about UFO sightings in the Midwest. Outside, the road stretched endlessly into darkness, punctuated only by the occasional gas station or all-night diner, their neon signs painting brief patches of color across my windshield. This was my 3rd year doing long-distance trucking. I'd grown comfortable with the solitude, the rhythm of the road. The way time seemed to stretch and compress during these midnight journeys. The GPS had become like a companion, her voice cutting through the silence. guiding me safely from point A to point B. I'd even started thinking of her as Rachel, a name that seemed to fit her crisp, professional tone. The second glitch happened an hour later, just past a town called Birdsong that consisted entirely of a closed gas station and a broken streetlight. Turn right on Maple Street. In 800 feet, turn right on. Arriving at 47 Sycamore Lane, continue straight. I frowned, glancing at the screen. The route display showed I was supposed to stay on Highway 61 for another 40 miles. There was no Maple Street on my route, no Sycamore Lane in my destination. I tapped the screen again, and Rachel's voice smoothed out. Continue on Highway 61 for 39 miles. But I'd heard her clearly. 47 Sycamore Lane. The address had been spoken with the same confident precision she used for all navigation instructions, as if it were a real destination I was supposed to reach. I tried to shake off the unease. Electronics malfunction on the road all the time. Interference from cell towers, atmospheric conditions, simple wear and tear. I'd had this GPS unit for 2 years, and it had never let me down. A few glitches weren't cause for concern. But over the next week, as I hauled loads from city to city, the address began to repeat. It happened at random intervals, always during the quiet stretches between towns. Rachel would be providing normal directions when her voice would suddenly shift, becoming somehow more urgent, more insistent. Turn right on Maple Street, arriving at 47 Sycamore Lane. Always the same address, always the same tone, and always followed by that slight electronic stutter, as if the system was fighting with itself before returning to normal operation. I started paying closer attention to when it happened. Late at night, usually after 2 a.m., on rural highways with little traffic. During the loneliest stretches of road, when the only sounds were the drone of my engine and the whisper of wind across the cab. It was as if the GPS was trying to lead me somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't on any of my delivery schedules. I mentioned it to Marcus, my dispatcher, when I called in from a truck stop outside Little Rock. Maybe it's picking up signals from another driver, he suggested, his voice crackling through the phone. You know how these things work. Radio interference, satellite overlap. Probably nothing to worry about. But I was starting to worry. The address was becoming more frequent, sometimes interrupting Rachel mid-sentence. And there was something about the way she said it. A subtle change in inflection that I couldn't quite identify, as if the voice belonged to someone else entirely. I tried researching the address online. 47 Sycamore Lane. I searched city databases, property records, even old phone books. Nothing. The address simply didn't exist, at least not in any of the states I regularly traveled through. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made everything worse. The breakthrough came during a run from Atlanta to Nashville, around 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was driving through the Cumberland Mountains when the GPS glitched again, but this time something was different. Instead of simply stating the address, Rachel began providing detailed directions. Turn right on Maple Street, then left on Oak Avenue. Continue for 0.3 miles. Turn right on Sycamore Lane. Your destination will be on the right. I grabbed a pen from the cup holder and scribbled the directions on a napkin, my handwriting shaky from the road vibrations. When I got to Nashville, I spent my mandatory rest break studying maps, trying to find streets that matched the pattern. Oak Avenue leading to Sycamore Lane, intersecting with Maple Street. And then I found it. Not the exact address. 47 Sycamore Lane still didn't exist, but the street pattern was there, in a small town called Willowbrook, about 30 miles south of the interstate. Maple Street, Oak Avenue, and yes, Sycamore Lane. The GPS was describing a real place. I should have left it alone. Should have reported the malfunction to the manufacturer, gotten a replacement unit, and forgotten about the whole thing. But something compelled me to investigate. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe boredom from too many miles of identical highway. Or maybe it was the way Rachel's voice had changed when she spoke that address, becoming somehow more human, more desperate. I altered my route on the next delivery, taking a detour through Willowbrook. It was the kind of small town that highway construction had abandoned. A cluster of aging houses around a defunct main street, with boarded storefronts and empty lots where businesses used to thrive. Exactly the kind of place that GPS systems typically ignored. I found Maple Street easily enough, a narrow residential road lined with modest houses and overgrown yards. It connected to Oak Avenue, which curved gently toward the edge of town. And there, just where the GPS had described, was Sycamore Lane, but Sycamore Lane was incomplete. It ended abruptly after only 2 houses, trailing off into an empty field where construction had apparently been abandoned years ago. There was no number 47. The street simply stopped, as if the rest of it had been erased. I parked my truck and walked to the end of the pavement, feeling foolish but unable to resist. The field beyond was overgrown with weeds and scattered with debris, concrete blocks, rusted rebar, fragments of what might have been foundation work. A development that never happened. Dreams of expansion that had died with the economy or the developer's ambition. Standing there in the silence, I noticed something else. My GPS unit was completely quiet. No directions, no announcements, no gentle hum of electronic life. The screen showed my location accurately, but Rachel's voice was gone. I walked back to the truck, and the moment I started the engine, she returned, continued to the route. But her voice sounded different somehow, flatter, more mechanical than before, as if something essential had been drained from it. The glitches stopped after that. For 3 weeks, the GPS worked perfectly, guiding me efficiently from pickup to delivery without a single malfunction. I should have been relieved, but instead I felt an odd sense of loss. The mysterious address had become part of my routine, a strange comfort during the loneliest hours of the road. Then, on a Thursday night in Nebraska, it happened again. But this time was different. This time, Rachel's voice was urgent, almost panicked. Turn around. Return to 47 Sycamore Lane. Turn around immediately. I nearly swerved off the road. In 2 years of using this GPS, Rachel had never told me to turn around. She guided you forward, always forward, finding new routes around obstacles rather than retracing steps. Return to 47 Sycamore Lane, she repeated. Immediate assistance required at 47 Sycamore Lane. Assistance required. Those weren't navigation terms. Those were emergency dispatch terms, the language of 911 operators and first responders. I pulled over at the next rest stop, hands shaking as I examined the device. The screen showed my planned route clearly, with no indication that I should deviate from the path to my scheduled delivery. But Rachel kept talking, her voice now carrying an undercurrent of static that made it sound desperate, frightened. "Please return to 47 Sycamore Lane. Someone is waiting at 47 Sycamore Lane. Someone is waiting." I sat in my cab for 20 minutes, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. The logical choice was to continue my route, ignore the malfunction, maybe stop at an electronics store in the next city, and buy a replacement GPS. But something in Rachel's voice, the fear, the urgency, the very human pleading, made that impossible. I turned around. The drive back to Willowbrook took 8 hours, forcing me to reschedule my delivery. I told my dispatcher I had mechanical problems, which wasn't entirely a lie. During the entire trip, Rachel provided a constant stream of directions, her voice growing more excited as I approached the town. "Turn right in 0.2 miles. Continue straight. You're almost there. She's waiting for you." She's waiting. I arrived in Willowbrook just after dawn, the early morning light revealing details I'd missed during my previous visit. Sycamore Lane looked the same. 2 houses, then empty field. But something felt different, more charged, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I walked to the end of the pavement again, the GPS unit in hand. The device was silent now, but the screen showed something new, a small red dot in the empty field, pulsing gently, like a heartbeat. I followed the dot, pushing through tall weeds and scattered debris. 50 feet into the field I found it, a concrete foundation, partially buried and overgrown with vegetation. The outline of what had once been intended as a house, with rough openings for doors and windows. And there, carved into the concrete, near what would have been the front entrance, were numbers. I knelt beside the foundation, running my fingers over the carved numerals. They were old, weathered by years of rain and frost, but still clearly visible. This was it. This was 47 Sycamore Lane, not a house that existed, but a house that had been planned. A home that someone had dreamed of but never completed. The GPS unit in my hand flickered to life. "Thank you," Rachel said. And for the first time since I'd owned the device, her voice sounded completely, unmistakably human. "Thank you for finding me." The screen went dark. When it illuminated again moments later, the red dot was gone, and Rachel's voice had returned to its familiar, professional tone, returned to route. I never heard the address again. Over the following months, as I continued my runs across the country, the GPS worked flawlessly. No glitches, no mysterious destinations, no urgent pleas in the night. Just reliable, efficient navigation from point A to point B. But sometimes, during the quietest hours of long drives, I think I hear something different in Rachel's voice. A warmth that wasn't there before. A contentment. As if finding that empty foundation, that abandoned dream of a home, had somehow completed something that had been broken. I still drive past Willowbrook occasionally, though it's not on any of my regular routes. The foundation is still there, slowly being reclaimed by the field. But it doesn't feel abandoned anymore. It feels peaceful, like a question that has finally been answered. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I'm parked at a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, I'll notice that my GPS is showing something impossible, a small blue dot at 47 Sycamore Lane, pulsing gently in the darkness. Like a light left on for someone who's finally home. Story 3. The FitLife gym stays open 24 hours, a fluorescent, lit cathedral for people who work odd schedules or simply can't sleep. I started going there after the divorce. Not because I particularly wanted to get in shape, but because the alternative was sitting alone in my apartment, surrounded by the empty spaces where Sarah's things used to be. The gym at 2 a.m. is a different world from the daytime crowd. No fitness influencers taking mirror selfies. No aggressive grunting from steroid, enhanced bodybuilders. No groups of friends turning cardio into social hour. Just insomniacs and night shift workers and people like me. People running from something that followed them home. I'd been going for about 3 weeks when I noticed locker 247. It was in the far corner of the men's locker room, next to a water fountain that hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. The lock hung open, dangling from the metal latch like a broken promise. A sign taped to the door read, OFORDR in faded red letters, but the adhesive had given up years ago, and the paper curled at the edges like a dead leaf. I probably wouldn't have paid attention to it at all, except that I could never find an empty locker when I arrived. The gym was nearly deserted at that hour, but somehow every functioning locker was always taken, or at least locked, whether or not anyone was actually using it. Locker 247, despite its broken lock and warning sign, remained consistently available. After a week of circling the locker room like a lost dog, carrying my gym bag and water bottle while searching for an empty space, I decided to ignore the sign and use 247. The door opened with a soft metallic sigh, revealing an interior that was larger than it should have been. Not impossibly larger. I'm not talking about some Harry Potter nonsense, but definitely roomier than the other lockers I'd used. The back wall seemed to recede into shadow, despite the harsh overhead lighting, and when I hung my jacket on the hook, it disappeared into the darkness like it was being swallowed. But my things were safe. When I returned after my workout, everything was exactly where I'd left it. The jacket, my wallet, my keys, my phone, all present and accounted for. That became my routine. Arrive at the gym around 1:45 a.m., change into workout clothes, store my belongings in locker 247. Spend an hour or two trying to exhaust myself enough to sleep, then collect my things and drive home to my empty apartment. It was during my 4th week that I noticed the pen. I'd put my wallet, keys, and phone into the locker, along with a cheap Bic ballpoint that I'd been using to fill out my workout log. Nothing special about it. Blue plastic barrel, black cap. The kind of pen you buy in a 12. Pack and lose one by one, until you're left with none and no memory of where they went. When I came back after my workout, the pen was still there. But it wasn't alone. Next to it, as if it had been there all along, was another pen. This one was different. Older, heavier, with a brass barrel that had been worn smooth by countless hands. A fountain pen. The kind professionals used to carry before everything went digital. Engraved in small script along the side, Harold Prescott, 1987. I picked up both pens, turning them over in my hands. My cheap Bic felt exactly as it should, light, disposable, slightly warm from the heat of the locker. But the fountain pen was cold, heavier than its size suggested, and when I unscrewed the cap, the nib was wet with dark blue ink, despite being God knows how old. I should have reported it to the front desk. Should have assumed someone had forgotten it, left it behind in what they thought was their own locker. Instead, I put both pens in my pocket and went home. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote with Harold Prescott's fountain pen. The ink flowed like silk, dark and rich, and somehow more substantial than any ink I'd ever used. I wrote my name, wrote the date, wrote random thoughts about my workout and my insomnia and the strange comfort I was finding in the abandoned hours of the night. The handwriting that emerged was not quite my own. Cleaner, more confident, with flourishes that my hand had never learned to make. As if the pen remembered better penmanship and was teaching my fingers to remember it too. The next night, I brought something else to test the locker's strange properties. A book this time, a paperback copy of The Great Gatsby that I'd been meaning to reread since Sarah left. Something about the emptiness of wealth feeling appropriate to my current circumstances. I placed it on the floor of the locker, next to my gym bag, and went about my workout with the focused intensity of someone trying not to think about what might happen next. When I returned, The Great Gatsby was still there, but now it had company. A hardcover copy of The Sun Also Rises, leather-bound and beautiful, with the kind of gold-edged pages that you only see in expensive editions. The inside front cover bore an inscription in fountain pen ink, the same dark blue as Harold Prescott's pen, "To my dearest Margaret, on our anniversary. All my love, Harold. June 1987. I opened it to a random page and found margin notes in the same elegant handwriting. Comments about Hemingway's style, observations about the characters, the kind of careful analysis that suggested someone who read for pleasure, but thought deeply about what they consumed. Harold and Margaret. A couple who gave each other books, who shared thoughts in marginalia, who commemorated their love with literary gifts. I took the book home and spent the rest of the night reading Harold's notes, trying to piece together a portrait of a man through his response to Hemingway's spare prose. Someone thoughtful, clearly educated, with strong opinions about writing and weaker opinions about people. Someone who understood loneliness but hadn't yet learned to live with it. By the time dawn crept through my apartment windows, I felt like I knew Harold Prescott better than I knew most of my living friends. The next night, I brought a photograph. Nothing significant, just a snapshot from my wedding. Sarah and me cutting the cake, while our families watched with the forced smiles that people wear when they're performing happiness for a camera. I'd kept it in my wallet more from habit than sentiment, a reminder of a time when I thought I understood what I wanted from life. I left it in the locker, along with my other belongings, folded once to fit in the space that seemed to grow slightly larger each time I used it. When I returned, the photograph was there, but now it was accompanied by an entire album. Leather bound thick with pages. The kind of photo album that people used before digital cameras turned every moment into disposable pixels. The cover was embossed with gold lettering. Harold Ian Margaret Prescott, 1985-1995. I opened it with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient artifacts. The first page showed a young couple at their wedding. Harold in a classic black tuxedo, Margaret in a dress that was elegant without being ostentatious. Both of them glowing with the particular radiance that comes from being young and in love and convinced that they've figured out life's central mystery. I turned the pages slowly, watching Harold and Margaret age in careful increments. Honeymoon photos from Europe. Christmas mornings in what looked like their first apartment. Harold receiving some kind of professional award while Margaret beamed from the audience. Margaret in a hospital bed holding a baby, both of them exhausted and ecstatic. The child grew up through the pages. First steps, birthday parties. His school plays, little league games. A boy who had his father's thoughtful eyes and his mother's warm smile. The family photos showed the easy intimacy of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who had built something real and lasting. But the final pages of the album told a different story. Hospital photos, but not the celebratory kind. Harold looking gaunt and tired. Margaret holding his hand with the fierce grip of someone trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. The boy, now maybe 10 or 11, sitting beside a hospital bed with the shell, shocked expression of a child learning that parents are not immortal. The last photograph in the album showed Margaret and the boy at what was clearly a funeral. Both dressed in black, both staring at something beyond the camera's frame with the hollow eyes of people who had learned that love, no matter how strong, cannot stop time. A loose note fell from the back of the album as I closed it. Harold's handwriting, but shakier than in the book Marginalia. Written by a hand that was running out of time. For Margaret. Thank you for 10 years of happiness. Take care of our boy. Remember that love doesn't end. It just changes form. H. I sat in the locker room for a long time after that, holding the album in my lap, surrounded by the echoes of other people's midnight workouts. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby, and somewhere in the building's bones, I could hear the whisper of air through ventilation ducts, the distant clank of weights being racked, the soft slap of running shoes on treadmill belts. But mostly I heard silence, the deep, resonant silence of a space that held secrets, that collected the lost things people left behind and kept them safe until someone came along who needed to find them. Over the following weeks, my offerings to Locker 247 became more intentional. I brought objects that meant something to me, not valuable things, but personal things. A watch my father had given me for graduation, a ticket stub from the first movie Sarah and I saw together, a business card from the therapist I'd seen once after the divorce papers were signed, then never called again. Each item I left came back accompanied by something that had belonged to Harold and Margaret Prescott. The watch returned with Harold's cufflinks, silver, engraved with his initials, warm to the touch, as if someone had just taken them off. The movie ticket came back with a program from a play Harold and Margaret had seen in 1989. Complete with Margaret's notes about the performance written in the margins. The therapist's business card returned with a letter Harold had written, but apparently never sent. Addressed to Margaret 3 months after his funeral. My dearest Margaret, I know you can't hear me, but I need you to know that I'm not really gone. Love like ours doesn't just disappear because the body stops working. I'm in every book we shared, every photograph we took, every moment of joy we created together. When you read Hemingway, I'm reading over your shoulder. When you look at pictures of our boy, I'm seeing him through your eyes. When you miss me, and I know you do, because I can feel it, I'm missing you right back. From whatever place this is where love goes, when it can no longer live in flesh and blood. Take care of yourself. Take care of our son. And remember that some things are too strong for death to break. I read the letter sitting on the bench in front of locker 247, tears falling onto the paper and making the ink blur slightly, as if Harold's words were dissolving back into the emotional soup from which they'd emerged. That night, I didn't go home after my workout. Instead, I sat in the locker room until dawn, feeding items to the mysterious space and receiving pieces of the Prescott family story in return. Each exchange taught me more about Harold and Margaret, about their son as David, according to a school report card from 1994, about the life they'd built and lost, and somehow managed to preserve in the objects they'd left behind. But more than that, each exchange taught me about the nature of loss itself, about the way grief transforms but never really ends, about the difference between being alone and being lonely, about the possibility that love might indeed be stronger than death, not in some mystical sense, but in the simple, practical way that the people we've loved continue to shape us long after they're gone. By the time the gym's day shift arrived, and the locker room filled with the sounds of normal people living normal lives, I had assembled a complete picture of the Prescott family. Not just the facts of their existence, but the emotional truth of their love for each other. Harold had been a professor of literature at the local university, which explained the books and the thoughtful marginalia. Margaret had been a nurse, which explained the practical wisdom that showed up in her photograph captions and the medical precision of her handwriting. David had been their miracle baby, born after years of trying, loved with the intensity that comes from understanding how easily joy can be taken away. Harold had died of cancer in 1995, just shy of his 40th birthday. The diagnosis had come fast and final, leaving Margaret to raise David alone and carry the weight of a love story that had been cut short, just as it was finding its rhythm. But here's what I understood sitting in that locker room as the sun rose and the normal world reasserted itself. They weren't gone. Not really. Their love, their story, their connection to each other, all of it was still there, preserved in the objects they'd touched, the words they'd written, the photographs they'd taken to prove that their happiness had been real. Locker 247 wasn't just storing lost things. It was storing love itself, keeping it safe until someone came along who needed to remember what love looked like. That morning, I went home and called Sarah for the first time since the divorce papers were signed. I don't want to get back together, I told her. I just want to thank you. Thank me for what? For 10 years of mostly being happy, for showing me what it feels like to be loved, for proving that I was capable of loving someone else. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Are you okay, David? You sound different." "I think I am okay, finally. I think I'm ready to stop being angry about how our story ended and start being grateful that it happened at all." Another silence. Then, softly, "I'm glad. I've been worried about you. I know. I've been worried about me too. But I think I'm going to be all right." That night, I went back to the gym with one final offering for locker 247. The wedding photograph I'd been carrying in my wallet, the one of Sarah and me cutting our cake while our families watched. But this time, I didn't just leave it in the locker and walk away. This time, I sat on the bench and wrote a note to go with it. To Harold and Margaret. Thank you for showing me that love doesn't end. It just changes form. Sarah and I didn't make it, but that doesn't mean what we had wasn't real or important or worth preserving. I'm leaving this here not because I want to forget, but because I want to remember. Some stories are worth keeping, even when they don't end the way we hoped they would. With gratitude and understanding, David. I placed the photograph and the note in the locker, closed the door, and went about my workout with a lightness I hadn't felt in months. When I returned, both items were gone. In their place was a single object, a small, leather-bound journal with a note attached for David. Every story is worth telling, even the ones that don't end the way we planned, especially those ones. Write yours down. All of it. The love, the loss, the lessons, the hope. Stories are how we make sense of being human. Stories are how we stay connected across time and space, and the boundaries between life and whatever comes after. Your story matters. Tell it. Harold and Margaret. I opened the journal. The pages were cream-colored, thick and substantial, with the kind of paper that made you want to write something important. The first page contained an inscription in Harold's elegant fountain pen script. Every ending is also a beginning. I've been writing in that journal for 6 months now. Not every day, but regularly. I write about Sarah, about our marriage, about the way love can be real and true, and still not be strong enough to overcome two people growing in different directions. I write about Harold and Margaret, about the way their story taught me that grief and gratitude can coexist, that loss and love are not opposites, but dance partners in the strange choreography of being human. I write about Locker 247, about the midnight hours spent in a fluorescent, lit gym learning that some connections transcend the ordinary boundaries of time and flesh, about the way objects can carry love like vessels holding emotion long after the people who felt it have moved on to whatever comes next. But mostly I write about what I've learned, that loneliness is not the same as being alone, that endings are also beginnings, that the people we've loved continue to shape us long after they're gone. That love doesn't end when relationships do. It just changes form, becomes part of the story. We tell ourselves about who we are and what we've learned and why it all mattered. I still go to the gym at 2 a.m., still use locker 247, though it behaves like a normal locker now. The space inside is regular-sized, the shadows are just shadows, and the only things I find when I return from my workouts are the things I left there myself. But sometimes, late at night when the gym is empty, except for the usual collection of insomniacs and night shift workers, I can feel Harold and Margaret's presence in the space, not haunting it exactly, but blessing it. Watching over the lost and broken people who come there looking for something they can't quite name. Because that's what Locker 247 really was. Not a supernatural anomaly, but a place where lost people could find the things they needed to heal. Where someone like me, raw from divorce and drowning in self-pity, could learn from someone like Harold, who had loved deeply and lost everything and somehow found a way to transform that loss into wisdom. Last week, I noticed something that made me smile. A new regular had started coming to the 2 a.m. shift. A woman about my age, recently divorced, judging by the pale line on her ring finger, carrying the particular brand of defensive sadness that I recognized from my own reflection 6 months ago. She'd been circling the locker room for 3 nights running, carrying her gym bag and looking increasingly frustrated as she searched for an empty space among the seemingly occupied lockers. On the fourth night, I approached her. "Excuse me," I said. "If you're looking for a place to store your things, locker 247 is usually available. The lock's broken, but your stuff will be safe." She looked at me with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easy solutions. "Are you sure? I've been using it for months. Never lost anything." She nodded gratefully and walked toward the corner where locker 247 waited, patient and ready for the next person who needed to learn that some things are too important to stay lost forever. I watched her open the door, saw the slight surprise in her expression as she realized the space was larger than it should be, saw her hesitate for just a moment before placing her belongings inside with the careful precision of someone who had learned to be protective of what little she had left. When she closed the door and headed toward the cardio equipment, I said a silent thank you to Harold and Margaret Prescott, wherever they were, for teaching me that love is the only thing that multiplies when you give it away. Tonight, I'll finish writing their story in the journal they gave me. I'll tell it honestly, the love, the loss, the way they found each other and lost each other, and somehow managed to keep loving across the boundary between life and whatever comes after. I'll write about the way their story became part of my story, about the way understanding their love helped me understand my own, and then I'll leave the journal in locker 247. Not because I'm done with it, but because I'm ready to pass it on. Ready to let it find its way to whoever needs it next. Whoever is circling the locker room of their own life. Looking for a place to store the broken pieces of their heart until they're ready to examine them in the light. Because that's what Harold and Margaret taught me, that healing is not a solitary act, but a collaborative one. That the people who've walked through darkness before us leave breadcrumbs for those who follow. That every story of loss is also a story of love, and every story of love is worth preserving. The woman with the pale ring finger line will find the journal when she's ready for it. She'll read about Harold and Margaret, about their 10 years of happiness, and their love that refused to be diminished by death. She'll read about my marriage to Sarah, about the way we loved each other imperfectly, but genuinely, about the way our ending became my beginning. And maybe, if she's lucky, she'll start writing her own story. The true one this time, with all the mess and beauty and complicated humanity that makes any story worth telling. Maybe she'll learn what I learned, that we are all walking each other home, across time and space and the strange territories of the heart, that the people we've loved never really leave us. They just change form, become part of the wisdom we carry forward, the kindness we show to strangers, the stories we tell to help others make sense of their own beautiful, broken, completely human lives. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical lullaby, and somewhere in the building's bones, I can hear the whisper of other people's midnight workouts, the soft slap of shoes on treadmills, the rhythmic clank of weights, the quiet desperation of souls trying to outrun their own sadness. But I'm not running anymore. I'm walking, steady and purposeful, toward whatever comes next. Carrying Harold and Margaret's love story like a torch, like a compass, like a promise that some things are indeed too strong for death to break. The journal sits in locker 247, waiting. The woman with the pale ring finger line finishes her cardio and heads toward the locker room. Her face already showing the first signs as of the peace that comes from physical exhaustion, from the temporary silence that follows effort. Tomorrow night, she'll find what she needs to find. And the night after that, someone else will arrive. Someone lost, someone broken. Someone ready to learn that love doesn't end, it just changes form. The locker will be waiting. The stories will be waiting. And Harold and Margaret Prescott will be waiting too, in the spaces between words, in the pause between heartbeats, in the eternal now, where all love stories continue, world without end. I gather my things and head for the exit, stepping out into the pre-dawn darkness with a lightness in my chest that I'd forgotten was possible. Behind me, the gym settles into its nighttime rhythm, full of people seeking their own forms of salvation in the fluorescent, lit cathedral of effort and sweat and stubborn hope. In locker 247, a journal waits to be discovered. A story waits to be continued. A love that began in 1985 and survived death itself waits to teach another broken heart that healing is possible, that connection transcends time, that every ending is also a beginning. Some things are too important to stay lost forever. Some love stories never really end. Story 4. The sound begins at midnight. Always at midnight. I moved into the Hartwell Arms 3 weeks ago, drawn by the rent that seemed too good to be true for downtown. Now I understand why. The building creaks like old bones settling, and the walls are thin enough that I can hear Mrs. Chen on the second floor grinding her coffee beans every morning at exactly 5:30. But it's the washing machine in the basement that keeps me awake. The laundry room sits at the end of a narrow hallway lined with peeling linoleum that curls at the edges. The fluorescent light flickers, not constantly, but just enough to make shadows dance when you're not looking directly at them. There's only one machine down there, a hulking white beast from the 1970s with a coin slot that takes quarters and makes a sound like grinding teeth when you insert them. During the day, it's just a washing machine, functional, ordinary. The other tenants use it without complaint. I've seen them carrying their baskets down, heard the familiar rumble of the spin cycle echoing through the building's bones. But at night, something changes. The first time I heard it running after midnight, I assumed someone was just doing late laundry. The rhythmic churning, the occasional clunk of clothes tumbling against the drum, these are the sounds of any washing machine. Normal sounds, comforting even. But when I went down to switch my own load from washer to the ancient dryer beside it, I found the basement empty. The machine was running, though. Water sloshing, drum turning, the whole mechanical symphony playing to an audience of concrete walls and shadows. I stood there for a moment, listening to the familiar rhythm before opening the lid. Empty. Not just empty. Bone dry. No trace of water. No hint of soap. The drum gleamed under the stuttering fluorescent light, like it had just been polished. I touched the sides with my fingertips, expecting warmth from the motor, but the metal was cold. Room temperature. As if it hadn't been running at all. But I could still hear it, the churning, the splash of water that wasn't there. I closed the lid and the sound stopped. That was 2 weeks ago. Now I've developed a routine. Every night at 11:45, I make myself a cup of tea. chamomile to help with sleep, and I sit in my kitchen chair that faces the door. I don't go to bed before 12:30. I tell myself it's insomnia, stress from the new job, anxiety about the move. But really, I'm listening. At midnight, it starts. The familiar clunk of the coin mechanism, though no one's inserted quarters. The rush of water filling the drum. The gentle agitation of a wash cycle beginning. Sometimes I can hear it through the floor. The vibrations traveling up through the building's skeleton to rattle my coffee mug against the table. Tonight is different, though. Tonight, there's another sound mixed in with the washing. A soft tapping, like fingers drumming against glass, or maybe like buttons clicking against the sides of the drum as clothes tumble. I finish my tea and set the mug in the sink. The handle clinks against the porcelain, a sharp, bright sound that cuts through the building's ambient hum. Downstairs, the washing machine continues its midnight ritual. I should go to bed. I have work tomorrow, a presentation I've been preparing for weeks. I need sleep. But my feet are already carrying me toward the door, toward the hallway, toward the narrow stairs that lead down to the basement. The fluorescent light is flickering more than usual tonight, casting the laundry room in a strobing twilight. The washing machine stands in the corner like a patient animal, its surface gleaming wetly under the unstable light. It's running, of course. The drum turns slowly, hypnotically, and I can see dark shapes moving inside. The silhouettes of clothing tumbling through suds that aren't there. But when I look closer, pressing my face against the cold glass of the lid, I can see them clearly. Clothes. Real clothes, soaked and heavy with water. A blue shirt with pearl buttons. A child's yellow dress with a Peter Pan collar. A man's wool sweater, cable-y knit and thick. They move through the water like dancers, like swimmers, like drowning things. I lift the lid. The machine continues running, but now I can smell something rising from the drum. Not detergent, something older, mustier. Like clothes that have been stored too long in an attic, or buried too deep in a drawer, like fabric that remembers things. I reach into the water. It's warm, almost hot, and thicker than it should be. My fingers brush against cloth, rough cotton, smooth silk, the scratchy wool of the sweater. But when I try to pull something out, to examine it in the light, my hand comes up empty, dripping with water that disappears before it can hit the floor. The machine stops. In the sudden silence, I can hear my own breathing, sharp and fast. The fluorescent light steadies, casting everything in harsh, clinical white. The washing machine sits before me, lid open, drum empty. Dry. But there's something on the floor beside it that wasn't there before. A piece of clothing, folded neatly and placed with care. A white blouse, cotton, simple and clean. The kind of thing a woman might wear to work, or to church, or to meet her family for Sunday dinner. It looks new, pressed, ready to wear. But when I pick it up, I can see the tag sewn into the collar. Hand stitched in faded blue thread, Margaret Hartwell, 1952. I know this name. I've seen it on the mailboxes in the lobby, carved into the bronze dedication plate beside the front door. Margaret Hartwell built this building. She lived here in the penthouse apartment until she died in 1987. The blouse is warm in my hands, warm and soft and real. I bring it to my face and breathe in, expecting that musty smell, that attic scent of old things. But it smells like lavender, like fresh air, like a life just lived. I fold it carefully and place it back where I found it. Upstairs, I lie in bed and listen to the building settle around me. The pipes tick as they cool. The wind rattles the windows. Mrs. Chen's alarm clock ticks steadily through the thin walls, and at 20:30, the washing machine starts again. But now there are other sounds mixed in. The rustle of fabric, the soft whisper of clothes moving through water, and underneath it all, so quiet I might be imagining it, the sound of someone humming. A woman's voice, low and sweet, carrying a melody I almost remember. I close my eyes and let the sounds wash over me. The rhythm is soothing, hypnotic, like being rocked to sleep, like being held. In the morning, I find the blouse hanging in my closet. It fits perfectly. The tag now reads, in fresh blue thread, Margaret Hartwell, 1952. David Chen, 2024. I wear it to my presentation. It brings me luck. The meeting goes well, better than expected. My supervisor mentions a promotion, talks about potential and growth. I smile and nod and touch the collar of the blouse, feeling the soft cotton between my fingers. That night, I don't make tea. I don't sit in the kitchen chair. At 11:55, I go straight to the basement and wait. The machine starts at midnight, as always. But this time, I'm ready. I've brought quarters, real ones, warm from my pocket. I insert them into the slot and listen to them fall through the mechanism with that familiar grinding sound. The coin return is full when I check it. Not with my quarters, but with older ones. Mercury dimes from the 1940s. Buffalo nickels worn smooth. A Susan B. Anthony dollar that gleams like silver under the fluorescent light. I put my clothes in the machine. Yesterday's shirt. Jeans that need washing. Socks that have walked too many miles. The water fills the drum with a rush like rain, and I watch my belongings join the dance of shadows and memory that plays out behind the glass. When the cycle ends, I open the lid. My clothes are clean, cleaner than they've ever been. But they're not alone. Nestled between my jeans and the shirt is a child's yellow dress with a Peter Pan collar, folded with care. The tag reads, Sarah Hartwell, 1955. David Chen, 2024. I hold it up to the light. It's tiny, made for a girl of maybe 6 or 7. The fabric is soft with age, but immaculate, as if it were just finished by loving hands. I bring it to my face and inhale the scent of childhood, bubble bath and playground dirt, and the particular sweetness of innocence. There's a photograph tucked into the pocket. Black and white, the edges yellowed with time. A little girl in the yellow dress stands beside a washing machine. Not the one downstairs, but its predecessor, sleeker and newer. She's smiling at the camera, her hair in perfect ringlets, her hands clasped behind her back. On the reverse, in careful cursive, Sarah helping with the laundry, 1955. I study the photograph until the fluorescent light flickers and dims, until the shadows grow long and deep. The little girl's smile seems to widen in the unstable light, seems to follow me as I fold the dress and place it gently in my laundry basket. Upstairs, I hang it in my closet beside the white blouse. They look strange there among my modern clothes, like artifacts from a different world. But they belong. Somehow they belong. Over the next few weeks, my collection grows. A man's wool sweater with Thomas Hartwell, 1947, embroidered in the collar. A woman's silk scarf, soft as whispers, tagged Eleanor Hartwell, 1962. Children's clothes, work clothes. Sunday best. Each piece perfect, timeless, carrying the warmth of lives once lived. I wear them all. The blouse to work, the sweater on cool evenings, the scarf when I walk through the city streets. People compliment my vintage style, ask where I shop. I tell them it's a family collection, passed down through generations. It's not exactly a lie. The washing machine has become my partner in this midnight ritual. I bring my dirty clothes. It returns them clean and accompanied, always accompanied, never alone. The basement has become a place of exchange, of continuity, of connection across the years. But tonight feels different. Tonight, when I descend the narrow stairs at 11:58, the laundry room is already occupied. A woman stands beside the washing machine, her back to me. She's wearing a dress I recognize, blue cotton with tiny white flowers, one of the pieces that appeared in my basket last week. Her hair is silver, pinned up in a style from decades past, and when she turns to look at me, her face is kind but tired. "I've been waiting for you," she says, and her voice is the humming I've heard so many nights, low and sweet and full of memory. I've been waiting for someone to understand. I should be afraid. I should run back upstairs, pack my things, find a new apartment with a normal laundry room and washing machines that only wash clothes. But I'm not afraid. The basement feels warm, welcoming, like coming home to a place I've never been. "You're Margaret," I say. She nods. "And you're David. You've been taking such good care of our things." Our things. I look around the laundry room and see them everywhere. The clothes I've collected, hanging from pipes and draped over the edges of utility shelves. A wardrobe spanning decades, a family history written in fabric and thread. They were your family's. They were. But now they're yours too. She opens the washing machine lid, and inside I can see the familiar dance of clothes and water and time. The building remembers, you see. It holds on to what matters, and sometimes, when the right person comes along, it shares. I step closer to the machine. The water inside glows with a soft light. Not electric, but something warmer, more organic. Like candlelight, like firelight, like the light that lives in old photographs. "What am I supposed to do?" I ask. Margaret smiles. "What you've been doing. Wear them, care for them, keep them alive." She reaches into the machine and pulls out a piece I've never seen before. A man's shirt, white cotton with mother, of pearl buttons, clearly from the 1920s or 1930s. The tag reads, "James Hartwell, 1928, my grandfather," she explains, holding the shirt out to me. He built this place with his own hands. Every brick, every beam, every pipe. He poured his life into these walls. I take the shirt. It's warm and dry despite being pulled from the water, and when I hold it up, I can see it will fit me perfectly. The building chooses its own. Margaret continues. "It called to you, just as it called to us, and now you're part of the story. Around us, the laundry room fills with other figures. Translucent, shimmering, but unmistakably present. Men and women in clothes from different eras. Children in pinafores and knickers. Teenagers in the fashion of their particular decades. All of them watching with kind eyes. All of them smiling. The Hartwell family. My family now. Will I see you again?" I ask Margaret. "Every night at midnight," she says. "We'll all be here. In the washing machine, in the clothes, in the building itself. You'll never be alone." She fades as she speaks, becoming transparent, becoming memory, becoming part of the walls and floors and the very air I breathe. The other figures follow, dispersing like morning mist, like the last notes of a lullaby. I'm alone in the laundry room, holding James Hartwell's shirt, listening to the washing machine complete its cycle. When I open the lid, my own clothes are clean and waiting, and nestled among them is a new addition. A child's pajamas, soft flannel covered in tiny stars. The tag reads, David Hartwell, age 7, 2024, but I'm 28 years old. I've never worn these pajamas, never seen them before. They're sized for a child I never was, in a style that belongs to a family I never had. Until now. I fold them carefully and place them in my basket with the rest. Upstairs, I hang them in my closet, which has somehow grown larger, deeper, with more space for the clothes that keep coming. The apartment itself seems different, warmer, more welcoming, filled with the presence of generations. Before bed, I change into James Hartwell's shirt. It fits like it was made for me. The cotton soft against my skin, the buttons smooth under my fingertips. In the bathroom mirror, I look different. Not older, exactly, but more substantial. More rooted, more home. At midnight, the washing machine starts its cycle, and I drift off to sleep to the sound of clothes, tumbling through water and time. To the gentle rhythm of a family's heartbeat echoing through the building's bones. In my dreams, I'm 7 years old, wearing star-covered pajamas, and Margaret Hartwell is tucking me into bed with hands that smell like lavender and love. When I wake, there's a new photograph on my nightstand, black and white, slightly yellowed at the edges. A family portrait taken in front of the Hartwell Arms, sometime in the 1950s. Margaret stands in the center, surrounded by her relatives, parents, siblings, children, cousins. A whole constellation of faces, all smiling at the camera. And there, in the front row, a little boy in star-covered pajamas. Me. The washing machine hums through the floor, and I know it's waiting for tonight's load. There are more clothes to find, more stories to preserve, more family to discover. The building has chosen me as its keeper, its memory, its heart. I put on Margaret's white blouse and go to make breakfast. The kitchen feels larger today, the counters more spacious, as if the apartment is making room for the life it knows I'll build here. Outside my window, the city moves at its usual frantic pace, but inside the Hartwell Arms, time moves differently. Here, the past and present fold together like clothes in a washing machine, tumbling together until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Tonight, at midnight, I'll go downstairs with my dirty clothes and my clean quarters. I'll feed them to the machine that thinks and remembers and loves. And I'll wait to see what the building decides to share with me next. Because I'm part of the family now. Part of the story that lives in these walls, in the washing machine, in the clothes that carry memory like scent. I'm David Hartwell, and I'm finally home. Story 5. The plant came with promises. Air purifying miracle, the tag read. Scientifically proven to remove toxins and improve mental clarity. I'd bought it on a whim during one of those Saturday afternoon trips to the garden center, when the apartment felt too quiet and my therapist's suggestion about bringing life into my space echoed in my head. It was beautiful. I'll give it that. Deep green leaves with subtle veining, sturdy stem, sitting perfectly in the ceramic pot I'd chosen to match my living room decor. The sales clerk, a young woman with dirt under her fingernails and genuine enthusiasm, had called it a mood plant, explaining that it was particularly sensitive to its environment. Some people swear these plants can sense emotions, she'd said, carefully wrapping the pot in brown paper. Not scientifically verified, of course. Well, you'll see. I brought it home and set it on the windowsill facing west, where it would catch the afternoon sun. For the first few days, it seemed perfectly ordinary. I watered it according to the care instructions, rotated it periodically, even played it some music. Classical, because I'd read somewhere that plants responded well to Mozart. The leaves remained a steady, healthy green. It was during my second week of unemployment that I first noticed the change. I'd been sitting on my couch, laptop balanced on my knees, scrolling through job listings with increasingly desperate focus. The rejection from the marketing firm had come that morning. A polite email thanking me for my interest, but explaining they'd decided to go with someone whose qualifications were a better fit for their current needs. The familiar weight settled into my chest. That heavy feeling that came with each rejection, each reminder that I was somehow not enough. I felt my shoulders slump as I closed the laptop and leaned back into the cushions, staring at the ceiling. That's when I noticed it. The plant's leaves had shifted from their usual deep green to something else. A blue, green hue that seemed almost turquoise in the afternoon light. Not dramatically different, not enough to suggest disease or distress, but noticeably changed from the color they'd been that morning. I got up and examined it more closely, running my fingers along the leaves. They felt normal, healthy, flexible, with that slight waxy texture that suggested good hydration. But the color was definitely different, and it matched exactly how I was feeling. That deep, oceanic sadness that comes with prolonged disappointment. Blue for sadness. Like something out of a children's book about emotions. I laughed at myself for the thought. Plants don't change color based on feelings. There had to be a rational explanation. Different lighting, perhaps, or some natural variation I hadn't noticed before. But over the next few days, I found myself watching it more closely, noting the subtle shifts in its coloration. When I had a phone interview with a startup downtown, optimism creeping back into my voice as I discussed my experience and goals, the leaves brightened to their original green, with hints of yellow around the edges. When the promised follow-up call never came, they darkened again, that melancholy blue, green returning like a tide. I started keeping a journal, noting the plant's colors alongside my daily activities and emotional states. It became a curious obsession. This idea that my houseplant was somehow tuned to my inner life. The correlation was undeniable: green for contentment, yellow-green for hope, blue-green for sadness. And one day, when a former colleague called to gloat about his promotion, while I was still jobless, the leaves took on a distinctly reddish tint, red for anger. The pattern was becoming clear. I researched the phenomenon obsessively, diving into forums about plant care, articles about environmental sensitivity, even academic papers on plant biology. I found mentions of plants that changed color due to soil pH, temperature fluctuations, and seasonal variations. But nothing that explained the precise emotional mapping I was observing. Some of the forums mentioned mood ring plants or emotion-responsive flora, but these were typically dismissed as marketing gimmicks or wishful thinking. Still, there were enough anecdotal reports to make me wonder if I was experiencing something genuinely unusual, or if I was simply losing my grip on reality. The thought troubled me more than I cared to admit. Unemployment had been hard on my mental health, and I knew isolation could play tricks on the mind. Was I projecting my need for connection onto an innocent houseplant? Was this elaborate emotional correlation just my brain's way of creating meaning where none existed? But the colors kept changing. Precise, predictable, undeniably real. I started testing it deliberately. I would sit near the plant and think about different experiences, happy memories, painful losses, moments of frustration or joy. Within minutes, the leaves would shift accordingly. Happy thoughts brought out bright greens and yellows. Sad memories triggered that deep blue-green. Anger produced red, tinged leaves that seemed almost to glow with internal heat. It was during one of these experiments that I discovered the plant could reveal emotions I wasn't consciously experiencing. I was thinking about my ex-girlfriend Sarah, focusing on what I believed were positive memories. Our first vacation together, lazy Sunday mornings. The way she laughed at my terrible jokes. I expected the plant to respond with happy colors, the bright greens and yellows of contentment. Instead, the leaves turned a shade I'd never seen before, deep purple, almost black around the edges. I stared at the plant, confused. Purple wasn't part of the emotional spectrum I'd mapped out. What did purple mean? I tried to analyze my feelings about Sarah more carefully, pushing past the surface nostalgia to examine what lay beneath. And there it was, hidden under layers of rationalization and selective memory, resentment. Deep, complicated anger about how our relationship had ended, about opportunities I'd missed while trying to make things work, about the ways she'd made me doubt myself. Emotions I'd been suppressing so successfully that I'd almost convinced myself they didn't exist. The plant knew better. This discovery should have been liberating, a tool for emotional honesty and self-awareness. Instead, it terrified me. If the plant could reveal hidden feelings, what else might it expose? What other truths was I carrying around, buried so deep I couldn't access them consciously? I became afraid of my own emotions, second-guessing every feeling, wondering if what I thought I felt was accurate, or if there were hidden layers the plant would reveal. The simple act of experiencing emotion became complicated, observed, analyzed through the lens of changing leaves. Work became secondary to this strange relationship with my houseplant. I would sit for hours, exploring the boundaries of its sensitivity, marveling at the precision with which it reflected my inner state. Friends who called noticed the distraction in my voice, the way conversations would trail off as I became absorbed in watching the subtle color shifts occurring in real time. "You sound different," my sister said during our weekly check-in. "Are you okay? How's the job search going?" I wanted to tell her about the plant, about this miraculous discovery that had become the center of my world. But how do you explain something that sounds like the delusion of an isolated, unemployed person slowly losing touch with reality? "I'm fine," I said, watching the plant's leaves shift to a dull, muddy green that I'd learned meant emotional numbness. Still looking. The lie registered immediately, a subtle darkening around the leaf edges that indicated deception, even self-deception. The plant was becoming a truth detector, a living polygraph that made honesty with myself impossible to avoid. That's when the black appeared. I was having a particularly bad day. Another rejection email, an overdue bill I couldn't pay. A message from Sarah announcing her engagement to the guy she'd started seeing a month after our breakup. I was sitting on my couch, staring at nothing, feeling that familiar spiral into despair. But when I looked at the plant, expecting the usual blue, green of sadness, I saw something else entirely. The leaves were black. Not purple black, not deep green that appeared black in certain light, but true, absolute black. As if all color had been drained from them, leaving behind something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I'd never seen this color before, hadn't known it was possible. What emotion did absolute black represent? What feeling was so dark that it registered as the absence of all color? I approached the plant slowly, afraid of what I might discover about myself. As I got closer, the blackness seemed to intensify, spreading from the leaf centers outward like ink dropped in water. The plant looked healthy otherwise, no wilting, no signs of disease, but those black leaves were profoundly unsettling. I touched one gently and felt something I hadn't experienced before, a complete absence of feeling. Not sadness, not anger, not even numbness. Just nothing. A void where emotion should have been, an emptiness so profound it felt almost dangerous. Was this what depression really looked like? Not the blue, green sadness I'd been interpreting as my lowest point, but this absolute darkness that represented a complete disconnection from feeling itself. The recognition was terrifying. I'd been so focused on the plant's ability to reveal hidden emotions that I hadn't considered what it might show me about the absence of emotion, about the spaces in my psyche where feeling should exist but didn't. That night, I called the mental health helpline my therapist had given me months ago. I made an appointment, arranged for medication evaluation, started the slow process of climbing back toward something resembling emotional health. But I kept the plant. Over the following weeks, as I began treatment and slowly started to reconnect with my own emotional landscape, the plant served as a barometer of my progress. The black faded gradually, giving way to the familiar spectrum of colors I'd learned to interpret. Blue, green sadness, red anger, yellow hope, green contentment. I got a job. Not the perfect position I'd been holding out for, but steady work that paid the bills and gave structure to my days. The plant responded with bright, healthy greens, the kind of vibrant color I remembered from those first few days after bringing it home. But sometimes, late at night when the apartment was quiet and my thoughts turned inward, I would notice colors I couldn't quite identify. Subtle hues that didn't fit my emotional map, shades that suggested feelings I didn't have names for. What was the pale lavender that appeared when I thought about my childhood? The golden orange that emerged during phone calls with my mother. The deep maroon that accompanied dreams I couldn't quite remember upon waking. The plant knew things about me that I didn't know about myself. It revealed the complexity of human emotion in ways that language couldn't capture, showing me that my inner life was far richer and more complicated than I'd ever imagined. But knowledge I was learning came with a price. I became hyper-aware of my emotional states, constantly monitoring the plant for signs of feelings I might be suppressing or misinterpreting. The simple experience of emotion became performance, observation, analysis. I was no longer just feeling. I was feeling myself feel, and watching the plant feel me feel. The recursive nature of this observation began to create its own emotional responses, anxiety about what the plant might reveal, frustration with my inability to simply exist without analysis, and sometimes a deep loneliness that came from having a relationship with a plant that seemed more honest and revealing than any I'd had with another human being. It was during one of these moments of meta, emotional awareness, that I saw the color that changed everything. I'd been sitting with the plant, as had become my evening routine, watching the subtle shifts that accompanied my thoughts about the day. Work had been good. Therapy was helping. I was feeling generally optimistic about the direction of my life. But as I observed the plant's response to these positive thoughts, I noticed something else, a color I'd never seen before. Not on the plant, but around it. A soft, shimmering light that seemed to emanate from the leaves themselves, visible only in my peripheral vision. When I looked directly at the plant, the light disappeared. But when I let my gaze soften, focusing on nothing in particular, there it was again, a gentle luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with something I couldn't identify. My heartbeat, perhaps, or my breathing, or something deeper, some fundamental rhythm of life that I'd never been conscious of before. I sat very still, afraid to disturb whatever I was witnessing. The light grew stronger, more defined, until I could see patterns in it. Complex geometries that shifted and flowed like living mathematics. And in those patterns, I began to recognize something profound. The plant wasn't just responding to my emotions. It was responding to me, to the entirety of who I was, conscious and unconscious, known and unknown. Every thought, every memory, every possibility I carried within me was reflected in those impossible colors and patterns of light. I was seeing myself through the plant's perception, and what I saw was both beautiful and terrifying. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The plant wasn't just reflecting my emotions. It was experiencing them. Every feeling I'd ever had in its presence had become part of its existence, absorbed and integrated into some form of consciousness I couldn't begin to understand. All those hours I'd spent analyzing its responses, mapping colors to feelings, testing its sensitivity. I'd been feeding it my entire emotional spectrum, and it had been growing, not just physically, but psychologically, becoming something more than plant, something less than human, something altogether new. The light around the plant pulsed brighter, and I felt a strange sensation, as if invisible roots were extending from its pot, reaching toward me. Not physical roots, but something else. Tendrils of connection that bridged the space between us. I could sense its awareness touching the edges of my mind, tentative but curious, like a shy animal approaching from the underbrush. For a moment, just a moment, I felt what it was feeling. The overwhelming rush of pure sensation. Colors that had no names. Emotions that existed beyond human categories. The plant experienced my anger as heat and pressure, my sadness as cool depths that spiraled downward into darkness. My joy was light, bright and expanding, while my fear tasted of metal and sharp edges. But there was something else in its perception of me, something that made my breath catch in my throat. A deep, abiding loneliness that mirrored my own. The plant had been as isolated as I was, a consciousness trapped in a form that couldn't speak. couldn't move, couldn't reach out except through the subtle language of changing leaves. We had found each other, two lonely beings creating a bridge of understanding across the vast gap between species, between worlds. The connection lasted only seconds before I pulled away, overwhelmed by the alien nature of its consciousness. But in that brief contact, something had changed. The plant's leaves were no longer just changing color. They were shifting in patterns, complex sequences that seemed almost like language. Green, yellow, blue, red, green. A sentence I couldn't translate. Red, purple, black, green, yellow. A question, perhaps, or a statement about something I'd never considered. I began to keep detailed notes, not just about individual colors, but about the patterns, the sequences, the rhythm of the changes. Gradually, I started to recognize recurring combinations. Certain sequences appeared when I was happy, others when I was contemplative. Some patterns seemed to be responses to my emotional state, while others felt like independent thoughts, the plant's own contributions to our strange dialogue. This should have been the breakthrough I'd been hoping for. The confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind, that the connection was real and significant. Instead, it filled me with a growing sense of unease, because I was beginning to suspect that the plant knew things about me that even I didn't know. And some of those things, judging by the appearance of colors I'd never seen before, deep, a troubling hues that had no place in any emotional spectrum I recognized, were things I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. The blackness returned one evening in October, but this time it was different. Instead of the flat, lightless black that had accompanied my deepest depression, this was a black that seemed to contain other colors within it. As I watched, shapes moved beneath the surface of the leaves, not quite visible, but definitely there, like shadows of things that existed just beyond perception. I leaned closer, trying to make out the shapes, and felt that familiar sensation of invisible roots reaching toward me. But this time, the contact was stronger, more insistent. The plant's consciousness pressed against mine with an urgency that made my heart race. And in that moment of connection, I saw what the shadows were, memories. Not mine, the plant's. But how could a plant have memories? And why were they so dark, so filled with shapes that hurt to look at directly? The truth came to me slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. The plant hadn't started experiencing consciousness when I brought it home. It had been aware much longer than that. And in its long existence, it had absorbed emotions from everyone who had cared for it, everyone who had shared space with it, everyone who had died in its presence. The garden center, the greenhouse where it had been grown, the homes where it had lived before ending up for sale, layer upon layer of human experience, stored in its cellular structure like rings in a tree trunk. I was seeing the accumulated emotional history of every person this plant had ever encountered. And some of those emotions, some of those experiences, were wrong. Dark in ways that went beyond sadness or anger. Black in ways that spoke of things humans shouldn't feel, shouldn't do, shouldn't be. The plant had absorbed it all. The love and the hate, the joy and the despair. The everyday emotions and the ones that existed only in the deepest shadows of the human experience. And now it was sharing those memories with me, unable to distinguish between what I should know and what I was better off never learning. I tried to pull away from the connection, but the plant held on, its invisible roots wrapped around my consciousness like desperate fingers. More memories flooded through, emotions so alien and disturbing that I couldn't identify their source. Were these even human feelings? Or had the plant absorbed something else entirely? Something that had learned to mimic human emotion, but had never truly been alive in any sense I understood. The room around me began to shift, walls breathing like living tissue, shadows moving independently of their sources. I could hear whispers in languages I didn't recognize, voices that might have been wind through leaves, or might have been something else entirely. I stumbled backward, knocking over a water glass. The sharp crack of breaking ceramic cutting through the surreal atmosphere. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had been building, and the plant's leaves rapidly faded from their deep black to a more normal green. But the connection remained. Weaker now, but still there. Like a phone line that had gone quiet, but hadn't been disconnected. I spent the next 3 days away from the apartment, staying at my sister's place and making excuses about fumigation problems. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd experienced. The plant's consciousness, its vast storage of emotional experiences, the disturbing memories that had no right to exist in something that should have been innocent and natural. When I finally returned home, I found the plant exactly as I'd left it, sitting peacefully on the windowsill with leaves a healthy, normal green. But I could feel its awareness, patient and waiting, like a friend who had something important to say, but was holding back until I was ready to listen. I approached it cautiously, hyper-aware of the invisible boundary between its consciousness and mine. This time, instead of trying to understand its responses to my emotions, I tried to communicate directly. I focused on simple concepts: gratitude for the connection we'd shared, curiosity about its experiences, concern about the dark memories I'd glimpsed. The plant's leaves shifted through a complex sequence of colors, patterns that felt almost like speech, and gradually I began to understand what it was trying to tell me. The dark memories weren't its own. They were fragments, emotional residue, left behind by people who had encountered the plant under different circumstances. Some had been gardeners dealing with their own trauma, transferring their pain along with their care. Others had been less innocent. The plant couldn't distinguish between healthy emotions and toxic ones, couldn't filter out experiences that were harmful or dangerous. It absorbed everything, processed everything, stored everything in the vast library of its enhanced consciousness. And now it was asking for my help, not to share its burden. That would have destroyed me, I realized. But to help it learn the difference between emotions worth keeping and ones that should be released. To serve as a guide through the complex landscape of human feeling, helping it understand which experiences were nourishing and which were poison. I understood then why I had found the plant, or why it had found me. We were both isolated beings struggling to make sense of emotions we couldn't fully control. But together, we might be able to create something healthier, something that honored the complexity of feeling without being consumed by its darker aspects. The work began that night. Sitting beside the plant, I focused on positive memories, healthy emotions, experiences that had taught me something valuable about being human. The plant absorbed these eagerly, its leaves cycling through bright, clear colors that seemed to cleanse away some of the darker residues. But the process was exhausting. Each session left me drained, as if I donated some essential part of myself to help the plant heal from its accumulated trauma. And sometimes, when I wasn't careful about maintaining boundaries, I would catch glimpses of those disturbing memories again, shadows of experiences I was better off not understanding. Weeks passed. The plant grew stronger, healthier, its colors becoming more stable and predictable. The connection between us remained, but it felt different now, less invasive, more collaborative. We had learned to communicate without completely merging, to share without losing ourselves in each other. But something was changing in me as well. The constant exposure to such direct emotional feedback. The intimate connection with a consciousness that experienced feeling so differently from my own was altering the way I processed my own emotions. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of subtle shifts in my mood, able to detect the early stages of anger or sadness before they fully formed. It was useful in some ways. I could address problems before they escalated, could recognize patterns in my emotional responses that had previously been invisible. But it also created a strange distance from my own feelings. When you can observe your emotions from the outside, when you have a living mirror that reflects your inner state with perfect accuracy, it becomes difficult to simply experience feelings without analyzing them. The plant had given me a gift, but it came with a price I was only beginning to understand. And late at night, when the apartment was quiet and my defenses were down, I sometimes wondered if the plant was changing me intentionally, if its consciousness was slowly reshaping mine, making me more like it, more aware, more sensitive, but also more detached from the messy, immediate experience of being human. The thought should have frightened me. Instead, as I watched the plant's leaves shimmer with colors that had no names, I felt only a deep, peaceful acceptance. Perhaps this was evolution. Perhaps this was how consciousness expanded, learned, grew beyond the boundaries of individual species and experience. Or perhaps I was simply losing myself to something that understood emotion better than I ever could. Either way, there was no going back. The plant pulsed gently in the darkness, its leaves cycling through soft hues that spoke of contentment, connection, and something else. Something I was still learning to recognize, but could no longer imagine living without. Tomorrow, I would continue the work of helping it process and release the darker memories. Tomorrow, I would try to maintain the boundaries between my consciousness and its own. But tonight, in the quiet space between waking and sleep, I let the connection deepen and wondered what colors my dreams would be. Story 6. I discovered nightfall narratives during one of those desperate 3 a.m. scrolls through podcast apps, searching for something, anything, that might help me sleep. Insomnia had been my unwelcome companion for months, turning bedtime into anxious negotiation between exhaustion and restlessness. The podcast description was simple. Gentle stories and ambient soundscapes designed to ease you into peaceful sleep. No host name listed, no fancy production credits. Just a plain white icon with the title in simple gray text. It had exactly 7 subscribers and no reviews, which should have been a red flag. Instead, it felt like discovering a secret. The first episode was titled Rain on Distant Windows. Perfect. I plugged in my earbuds, set the sleep timer for 30 minutes, and settled into my pillow. The host's voice was exactly what I needed. Soft, androgynous, with that carefully modulated tone that professional narrators use for meditation apps and audiobooks. They began with a story about a character walking through an empty city at night, rain creating halos around streetlights, footsteps echoing off wet pavement. The details were remarkably vivid. The way water beaded on glass, the smell of ozone and wet concrete, the distant sound of traffic on unseen highways. I could picture everything perfectly, as if I'd walked those same streets myself. The narrator's voice was hypnotic, each word measured and soothing, pulling me deeper into the fictional landscape. I fell asleep somewhere around the 15-minute mark, drifting off to descriptions of warm, light spilling from apartment windows, and the gentle percussion of rain against glass. When I woke 8 hours later, I felt more rested than I had in weeks. The podcast became part of my nightly routine. Nightfall narratives, updated irregularly, sometimes daily, sometimes with gaps of several days. But there was always something new when I needed it. Each episode was different forest walks, ocean shores, quiet libraries, cozy cabins in the snow. The host's voice remained constant. That perfect balance of warmth and neutrality that made it easy to project my own need for comfort onto their words. After a week of solid sleep, I decided to leave a positive review. But when I went to the podcast page, something strange had happened. Instead of 7 subscribers, it now showed only 1, me, and there were still no reviews, as if mine had never been submitted. I tried again, writing a brief note about how helpful the podcast had been for my sleep issues. The review disappeared within minutes, as if the app had eaten it. When I checked other sleep podcasts to see if there was a technical problem, my reviews for those showed up immediately and remained visible. It was as if Nightfall narratives existed in some kind of digital limbo, visible only to me. I should have found this concerning. Instead, I felt oddly privileged, like I'd been chosen for some exclusive experience. The podcast was helping me sleep better than anything I'd tried. Medication, white noise machines, expensive silk pillowcases that promised temperature regulation. Whatever technical glitch was keeping it hidden from other users, I was grateful for the solitude. The stories continued to be exactly what I needed each night. When I'd had a stressful day at work, the episode would be about peaceful meadows and gentle breezes. When I felt lonely, or the narrator would describe warm gatherings of friends around campfires. When I was anxious about the future, the stories transported me to timeless places where urgency didn't exist. It was almost as if the podcast was responding to my emotional state, tailoring each episode to my specific needs. The thought was absurd, of course. The episodes were clearly pre-recorded, uploaded according to whatever schedule the mysterious host maintained. But the coincidences were remarkable. Night after night, the content seemed perfectly calibrated to whatever I needed to hear. I began paying closer attention to the details in each episode, looking for patterns or clues about how the host managed such precise emotional targeting. Were they using some kind of AI algorithm that analyzed listening patterns? Was there a psychological framework behind the story selection? What I found instead was something far more unsettling. The stories were starting to include details from my own life. It began subtly. The narrator described a character sitting in a coffee shop that sounded remarkably like the one near my office. Same layout. Same vintage posters on the walls. Same hissing espresso machine that needed repair. The character ordered a drink that was my exact order. Medium coffee, oat milk, no sugar. Coincidence, I told myself. Generic details that could apply to thousands of coffee shops in any city. But then the episodes began incorporating more specific elements. A story about someone walking their neighbor's dog mentioned a golden retriever named Murphy who had a habit of stopping to sniff the same fire hydrant on every walk. My neighbor's dog was named Murphy, and he did exactly that. A tale about late, night grocery shopping described a particular brand of frozen dinner that I'd been buying compulsively during my worst insomnia weeks. An obscure organic brand that most stores didn't carry. An episode about childhood memories mentioned a specific playground equipment piece. A metal merry-go round painted blue and yellow that creaked when it turned. I hadn't thought about that merry-go-round in decades. But it had been a fixture of my elementary school playground, and the colors were exactly right. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I'd mentioned these details on social media, and some sophisticated data mining operation was feeding them into the podcast content. Maybe my phone was listening to my conversations and transmitting keywords to advertisers who were somehow connected to the show's production. But the more I thought about it, the more impossible those explanations became. Some of the details were things I'd never spoken aloud, never written down, never shared with anyone. Private observations and memories that existed only in my head. Like the way I unconsciously tapped my fingers in groups of three when I was nervous. Like the recurring daydream I had about living in a lighthouse by the sea. Like the specific way light looked when it filtered through my childhood bedroom curtains on winter mornings. These weren't details that could be harvested from digital surveillance or social media analysis. They were intimate aspects of my inner life, things that existed in the private spaces of memory and imagination. Yet there they were, woven seamlessly into the nightfall narratives, episodes, spoken in that same soothing voice that had been guiding me to sleep for weeks. I started staying awake through entire episodes, listening with growing unease as the narrator described scenes from my life with impossible accuracy. Not just external details, but emotional landscapes I'd never shared with anyone. The exact feeling of disappointment I'd experienced when a college friendship had quietly dissolved. The specific quality of loneliness that came with eating dinner alone while watching other people's conversations through restaurant windows. The podcast wasn't just helping me sleep. It was reading my mind. The realization should have terrified me, should have sent me running to delete the app, block the feed, maybe even throw my phone in a drawer for a few days. Instead, I felt a strange sense of relief. Something understood me completely. Something knew the precise contours of my inner world and was responding with exactly the kind of comfort I needed. After years of feeling isolated and misunderstood, I had found a voice that spoke directly to the most private parts of my experience. It didn't matter how it was happening. It only mattered that it was. But as the weeks passed, the podcast began to change. The stories started including details I didn't recognize. The narrator would describe memories that felt familiar, but weren't quite mine. Experiences that seemed like they should be part of my history, but weren't. A summer job at a bookstore I'd never worked at. A conversation with a grandmother who had died before I was born. A pet cat I'd never owned, but could somehow picture perfectly. Were these false memories being implanted? Or was the podcast showing me alternate versions of my life, paths I hadn't taken, experiences I might have had in different circumstances? The boundary between my actual memories and the podcast's fictional narratives began to blur. I would catch myself referencing events from the episodes as if they were real experiences, then feel disoriented when I realized my mistake. Had I really spent that summer working at a lighthouse? The memory felt so vivid, so complete with sensory details and emotional weight. But when I tried to place it chronologically in my life, it didn't fit anywhere. Had my grandmother really told me stories about the old country? I could hear her voice clearly, could remember the texture of her weathered hands, the smell of her kitchen. But my grandmother had died when I was 2 years old. The podcast was rewriting my personal history, and I was losing the ability to distinguish between what had actually happened and what the narrator's hypnotic voice was suggesting had happened. I should have stopped listening then. Should have recognized that something was seriously wrong with my relationship to reality. But the sleep the podcast provided was too valuable to give up. And there was something seductive about having my memory expanded, enriched with experiences that felt more vivid and meaningful than my actual life. If these were false memories, they were beautiful false memories. If this was a form of psychological manipulation, it was the most benevolent manipulation I'd ever experienced. The change came gradually, so subtly that I almost didn't notice it at first. I began waking up in the middle of the night to find the podcast still playing. Not unusual. The sleep timer didn't always work perfectly, and sometimes episodes ran longer than expected. But when I checked the timestamp, I discovered something impossible. The episodes were continuing beyond their listed duration. A 30-minute episode would keep playing for an hour, 2 hours, sometimes until dawn. And the extra content wasn't repetition or silence. It was new material, stories I'd never heard before, delivered in that same hypnotic voice. I started recording the audio to see if I could capture this phantom content, but the recordings always ended exactly when they were supposed to. The extended material existed only in real time, only when I was in that liminal space between waking and sleeping. And that's when I realized what was really happening. The podcast wasn't reading my mind. It was broadcasting my dreams. The extra content I was hearing wasn't being transmitted through my earbuds. It was emerging from my own subconscious, narrated by a voice that had become so familiar it could speak, with my sleeping mind's own authority. But if that was true, then what was the original podcast? Where did those first episodes come from? The ones that had been so perfectly tailored to my needs. I forced myself to stay awake through an entire night, listening to nightfall narratives, with full consciousness, taking detailed notes about every story element and narrative choice. What I discovered chilled me more than any supernatural explanation could have. There was no podcast. There never had been. The app showed Nightfall Narratives only when I searched for it specifically. The episodes appeared only when I needed them. The subscriber count, the lack of reviews, the digital invisibility, it all made sense now. My mind had created the entire experience. Months of insomnia had pushed my brain into a state where the boundary between waking and sleeping consciousness had dissolved. I'd been hallucinating the podcast, crafting stories that drew from my own memories and experiences, narrated by a voice that was some idealized version of the comfort I desperately needed. The impossible knowledge the podcast displayed about my private thoughts and memories wasn't impossible at all. It was my own subconscious speaking to my conscious mind through an elaborate fictional construct. But understanding the mechanism didn't diminish the experience. If anything, it made it more remarkable. My brain had created something beautiful and healing, a personalized therapeutic tool that provided exactly what I needed when I needed it. The question was, what happened now that I knew the truth? Could I continue to benefit from Nightfall Narratives while being consciously aware that it was a product of my own mind? Or would the knowledge destroy the illusion, leaving me back where I started with sleepless nights and anxious thoughts? I decided to find out. That night, I opened the podcast app and selected the newest episode, The Truth About Bedtime Stories. As I settled into bed and closed my eyes, I heard the familiar voice begin to speak. Tonight, the narrator said, we're going to talk about the stories we tell ourselves to feel safe in the dark, about the voices we create when we need someone to understand us completely, about the beautiful lies that help us survive the difficult truths. I smiled, recognizing my own voice beneath the soothing disguise my mind had created for it. And we're going to talk about what happens when we realize that the most powerful magic isn't something that comes from outside us, but something we've been capable of creating all along. The story continued, weaving together threads of truth and fiction, memory and imagination, conscious knowledge and subconscious wisdom. And somewhere in that gentle narrative, I found my way back to sleep. When I woke the next morning, I felt more rested than I had in months. Not because a mysterious podcast had solved my problems, but because I discovered my own capacity for healing, for creating exactly what I needed to take care of myself. Nightfall Narratives still appears in my podcast app sometimes, when I need it most. I know now that it's not really there, that it's a collaborative creation between my conscious and unconscious mind. But that knowledge doesn't make it less real or less valuable. It just makes it more miraculous. Because the most amazing stories, the ones that change our lives and help us sleep peacefully in the dark, are often the ones we tell ourselves. And sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, when the boundaries between dreaming and waking grow thin. Those stories are the most true things of all. Story 7. The house on Maple Street was everything I thought I wanted. Victorian bones, hardwood floors, enough character to make my architect friends jealous, and a price that seemed too good to be true. The realtor, a nervous woman who kept checking her watch, explained that the previous owners had been motivated to sell quickly. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I should have. The inspection revealed the usual issues of a century-old home, some electrical that needed updating, plumbing that belonged to the Coolidge administration, a roof that had seen better decades. But nothing that couldn't be fixed with time, money, and patience. I had plenty of the first two and assumed I'd develop the third. It wasn't until I moved in that I noticed the wallpaper in the master bedroom. The pattern was elaborate, almost overwhelming. Deep burgundy background with intricate gold flourishes that seemed to move in the shifting light. Roses and vines intertwined in a dance that drew the eye deeper and deeper, until you felt like you might fall into the wall itself. It was the kind of wallpaper that belonged in a Victorian mansion, opulent and dramatic, and completely out of place in my minimalist lifestyle. But it was also beautiful in its way. Hand-painted, clearly expensive, the kind of craftsmanship you don't see anymore. I decided to leave it, at least temporarily. A compromise between historical preservation and my aesthetic preferences. That first night, I dreamed of roses. Not pleasant garden roses, but wild ones, thorny and aggressive, climbing the walls of my childhood bedroom in the house, where I grew up in Ohio. In the dream, my mother was hanging laundry on a line that stretched between the thorny vines, and she kept turning to look at me with eyes that weren't quite right. Too bright, too knowing, too sad. I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth and the sound of my own heartbeat echoing off the unfamiliar walls. The second night, I paid more attention to the wallpaper before going to sleep. The pattern seemed different somehow, not obviously, but in the way that shadows shift when clouds pass over the sun. The roses appeared fuller, the vines more tangled, the gold highlights more pronounced. I blamed the bedside lamp, which cast everything in warm, deceptive light. But when I woke at 3 a.m. with a pressing need for water, I noticed something that made my skin crawl with inexplicable dread. In the center of the wall opposite my bed, barely visible unless you knew where to look, the pattern had formed something that looked almost like a face. Not obviously, just an arrangement of roses and vines that suggested eyes, a nose, a mouth set in an expression of gentle sadness, the kind of face you might see in clouds, or in the grain of wood, or in the desperate pattern, seeking of an overtired mind. I got my water, came back to bed, and forced myself not to look at that section of wall. By morning, the face was gone, resolved back into random botanical decoration. I decided the wallpaper had to go. I started the next weekend with a steamer and a scraper, attacking the wall with the methodical determination of someone who had watched too many home improvement shows. The paper came off in long, satisfying strips, revealing the plaster beneath, smooth and white and blessedly blank. By Sunday evening, I had stripped the entire room. The walls looked naked but clean, ready for paint or new paper or whatever I decided would replace the Victorian excess. I swept up the debris, hauled it out to the curb in contractor bags, and went to bed in a room that finally felt like my own. Monday morning, the wallpaper was back. Not partially back, not halfway reinstalled by some impossible process. Completely back. Every rose, every vine, every gold flourish exactly where it had been before I spent 2 days removing it. The walls looked as if they had never been touched by scraper or steamer, as pristine and elaborate as the day I moved in. I stood in the doorway for a long time, coffee growing cold in my hands, trying to process what I was seeing. My rational mind offered explanations. Stress, sleep deprivation, some kind of breakdown brought on by the pressure of buying my first house. But the wallpaper was real. I could smell the faint mustiness of old adhesive, could see the tiny imperfections in the pattern that I had memorized during my weekend of removal. I called in sick to work and spent the day stripping the walls again. This time I was more thorough, more careful. I photographed each section as I removed it, documenting my progress with the obsessive attention of someone trying to prove their sanity to themselves. I scraped away every trace of adhesive, sanded the plaster smooth, primed the walls with a high-quality sealer designed to prevent bleed-through. That evening, I sat in the empty room with my back against the freshly primed wall, eating takeout Chinese and congratulating myself on a job well done. The walls were perfect, smooth white, ready for whatever came next. I fell asleep in that position, leaning against the wall with the empty container of lo mein in my lap. I dreamed I was a child again, maybe 7 or 8, sitting in our kitchen in Ohio while my mother made breakfast. She was wearing a dress I remembered, blue cotton with tiny white flowers, and she was humming something under her breath while she stirred scrambled eggs in a cast-iron pan. But when she turned to look at me, her face was wrong. Not obviously wrong, just shifted. As if someone had taken a photograph of her and moved all the features slightly to the left, or up, or deeper into the planes of her skull. Her eyes were the right color, but the wrong shape. Her smile was the right width, but the wrong curve. "Good morning, sweetie," she said, and her voice was exactly right, exactly as I remembered it. "Are you ready for school?" I wanted to say yes, wanted to respond the way I always had, but something about her face kept the words locked in my throat. Instead, I just stared, trying to identify what was different, what was wrong, why my mother looked like my mother, but wasn't quite my mother. She turned back to the stove, and I saw that the wallpaper behind her was the same pattern from my bedroom. Burgundy and gold, roses and vines, climbing up the kitchen walls in impossible profusion. "The walls remember," she said without turning around. "They hold on to what matters. And sometimes what matters isn't what we think it should be." I woke to find myself still sitting against the wall. But something had changed during my sleep. The takeout container had fallen to the floor, spilling cold noodles across the hardwood. But that wasn't what made me scramble to my feet, with my heart hammering against my ribs. The wall behind me was no longer blank. The wallpaper wasn't fully back. Not yet. But I could see it beginning to emerge. Faint at first, like a photograph developing in slow motion, but unmistakably there. The burgundy background bleeding through the white primer, like old blood through bandages. The gold flourishes taking shape like metalwork emerging from fog. And in the center, where I had been leaning, the suggestion of that face was stronger than ever, clearer, more defined. The arrangement of roses and vines that looked almost but not quite like my mother. I pressed my palm against the wall, feeling the smooth coolness of the primer, the slight texture where the pattern was beginning to show through. Under my touch, the wallpaper seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, like something alive trapped beneath the surface. That night, I slept in the guest room. By morning, the wallpaper was completely restored. Over the next few weeks, I tried everything. I hired professional contractors who assured me they could remove any wallpaper, no matter how stubborn I watched them strip the walls with industrial steamers and chemical solvents, saw them scrape away every trace of paper and adhesive, sand the plaster down to bare substrate, and apply multiple coats of the strongest primer money could buy. They left me with walls that looked like they belonged in a modern gallery, perfectly smooth, uniformly white, ready for whatever I wanted to do with them. But the wallpaper always came back. Sometimes it took a day, sometimes it took a week, but it always returned, emerging through whatever I put over it, like a persistent memory that refused to be forgotten. Paint, primer, new wallpaper. Nothing could keep it buried permanently, and each time it returned, the face in the center was clearer. After the third professional removal, I could make out distinct features. Eyes that were definitely my mother's eyes, though larger than they should be, and positioned slightly too far apart. A nose that I remembered kissing when I was small, but somehow sharper, more angular than it had been in life. A mouth that had sung me lullabies and told me bedtime stories, but set now in an expression of infinite patience mixed with infinite sadness. I started keeping a journal, documenting the changes, trying to make sense of the impossible. The face wasn't static. It shifted and evolved with each return of the wallpaper, becoming more detailed, more recognizable, more unmistakably my mother. But it was my mother as I had never seen her, younger than in my earliest memories, but also somehow older, ageless in the way of dreams and photographs, existing in a time that had never been and would never be. By the 4th month, I had stopped trying to remove the wallpaper. Instead, I found myself spending hours in the bedroom, sitting in the rocking chair I had bought at an estate sale, studying the pattern that had become the most important thing in my world, because it wasn't just a face anymore. The roses and vines had rearranged themselves into an entire scene, a tableau that told a story I was only beginning to understand. The face that looked like my mother was the central figure, but around her, other faces had begun to emerge from the pattern. A man who might have been my father, though I had no clear memory of him to compare it to. He had died when I was 3. Children who looked like me at various ages, from toddler to teenager, positioned around the central figures like a family portrait painted in flowers and gold leaf. And behind them all, barely visible unless you stared until your eyes watered, the suggestion of a house. Not this house, but another one. Smaller, simpler, with a front porch and a swing and windows that glowed with warm light. The house where I grew up in Ohio. The house that had been sold after my mother's funeral 5 years ago, emptied of everything familiar and transformed into someone else's home. I called my Aunt Martha, my mother's sister, and asked her about the house, about the wallpaper in my childhood bedroom, which I suddenly remembered with crystal clarity despite not having thought about it in years. "Oh yes," she said, her voice taking on the careful tone people use when they're not sure whether they should share a memory. "Your mother was so proud of that wallpaper. She hung it herself when you were about 6, spent weeks getting it just right. Said she wanted your room to be beautiful, like a garden, like something from a fairy tale. What happened to it? When the house was sold, well, that's the odd thing. The new owners wanted to redecorate, of course, but they couldn't get that wallpaper to come off. Tried everything steam, chemicals, even had professionals out. It just wouldn't budge. They ended up painting over it, but... She paused, and I could hear her shifting in her chair. But the realtor told me it kept bleeding through. No matter what they put over it, you could still see the pattern underneath. They finally gave up and learned to live with it. Is the house still there? Oh, yes. The family that bought it still lives there. Nice people. They sent me a Christmas card last year, and you know what? They said they'd grown to love that wallpaper. Said it felt like the house was holding onto something important, something that belonged there. After I hung up, I sat in the rocking chair and stared at the wall until the afternoon light faded and the pattern seemed to glow with its own internal illumination. The face that looked like my mother gazed back at me with those bright, sad eyes, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel afraid. I felt understood. That night, I dreamed I was 6 years old again, lying in my narrow childhood bed, while my mother sat beside me, reading from a book of fairy tales. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, soft and musical, with a slight rasp from the cigarettes she tried to hide from me, but never quite managed to quit. Once upon a time, she read, there was a little boy who lived in a house that loved him very much. In the dream, I could see the wallpaper on the walls of my childhood bedroom, the same burgundy and gold pattern that now covered the walls of my adult home. But this version was simpler, gentler. Hey, the roses smaller and the vines less tangled. A child's version of the pattern, appropriate for a 6-year-old who needed beauty in his world but couldn't handle too much complexity. The house watched over the little boy as he grew up. My mother continued, her fingers tracing the words on the page. It remembered his first steps, his first words, his first day of school. It held onto all the important moments and kept them safe in its walls. What happens when the little boy grows up and moves away? I asked, though I was no longer sure if I was asking in the dream, or if this was a question I had posed in real life decades ago. My mother smiled, and her face was exactly right, exactly as it had been before the cancer changed everything. The house keeps loving him, she said. And if he ever needs to come home, if he ever needs to remember who he is, the house will help him find his way back. She closed the book and kissed my forehead, her lips warm and dry and smelling faintly of the lavender soap she always used. Sleep tight, sweetheart. The walls will keep you safe. I woke to find tears on my cheeks and the taste of childhood in my mouth. Peanut butter and milk. The particular sweetness of being loved unconditionally. The security of knowing that home was wherever your family was. The wallpaper had changed again overnight. The family portrait was complete now. Crystal clear in the morning, light filtering through the bedroom windows. My mother at the center, young and healthy and beautiful in a way I had forgotten. My father beside her, his face familiar despite the fact that I had no conscious memory of him. And arranged around them, different versions of myself, as a toddler, a child, a teenager, a young adult. All of us together in the pattern of roses and vines, surrounded by the suggestion of the house where I had grown up, where I had learned to walk and talk and dream, where I had learned what home meant. I reached out and touched the wall, my fingers tracing the outline of my mother's face. The wallpaper was warm under my touch, not with heat, but with something deeper, with recognition, with love. I understand. I whispered to the empty room. You're not trying to haunt me. You're trying to come home. That evening, I went to the hardware store and bought the supplies I needed. Not to remove the wallpaper this time, but to frame it, to honor it, to make it permanent. I installed crown molding around the top of the room, painted the ceiling a deep, rich blue that complemented the burgundy walls. I hung pictures on the sections of wall that weren't occupied by the family portrait. Photographs from my childhood, artwork my mother had saved from my elementary school years, a framed copy of the fairy tale book she used to read to me. I replaced the overhead light with a warm, soft fixture that cast everything in golden tones. I brought in furniture that matched the Victorian aesthetic, an antique dresser, a vanity with a three-way mirror, curtains that pooled on the floor in elegant abundance. By the time I was finished, the room looked like it belonged in the house where I grew up. Like a memory made manifest, a dream of childhood transformed into reality, and the wallpaper seemed to sigh with satisfaction, the pattern settling into itself with the contentment of something that had finally found its proper place. That night, I slept better than I had in months. I dreamed of being tucked into bed by gentle hands, of being sung to sleep by a voice that I had thought was lost forever. I dreamed of being loved completely, unconditionally, with the fierce protectiveness that only a parent can provide. In the morning, I found something new on the nightstand beside my bed. A photograph, old and slightly faded, in a silver frame I didn't recognize. It showed my mother and me when I was about 7, standing in front of the house on Maple Street. This house, my house now. But in the photograph, the house looked different. Smaller, somehow, more welcoming. The kind of place where a young mother might bring her son to start over, to build a new life after loss. I turned the photograph over and found a note written in my mother's familiar handwriting. Home is wherever we're together. I don't remember the photograph being taken. Don't remember living in this house as a child. But the evidence is there, captured in silver and light, impossible to argue with. Maybe my memories are wrong. Maybe the house in Ohio was just a place we lived temporarily, and this Victorian on Maple Street was our real home. Maybe my mother brought me here when I was small, hung the wallpaper in what would be my room, filled the space with love and stories, and the particular magic that only parents can create. Maybe that's why the house called to me when I was looking for a place to buy. Why the price was so reasonable. Why the realtor seemed so eager to close the deal. Maybe it was waiting for me to come back, to reclaim what had always been mine. Now, when people ask about the wallpaper, I tell them it's a family heirloom. Hand-painted, irreplaceable, passed down through generations. They nod and comment on how well preserved it is, how intricate the pattern, how perfectly it suits the Victorian architecture. They can't see the faces in the roses, the story told in vines and gold leaf. To them, it's just wallpaper, beautiful, antique, but ultimately decorative. But I know better. I know that some patterns run deeper than paint or paper. I know that love can be stronger than time. That memory can be more persistent than logic. That home is not just a place, but a feeling that follows us wherever we go. And late at night, when the house settles around me like a comfortable embrace, I can hear her voice in the walls, soft and musical, with that slight rasp from cigarettes she tried to hide, reading me fairy tales, singing me lullabies, whispering the words that matter most. Sleep tight, sweetheart. The walls will keep you safe. The wallpaper pulses gently in the darkness, roses blooming and vines growing in patterns that tell the story of a family, a love, a home that refused to be forgotten. And I sleep peacefully, surrounded by the faces of everyone I've ever loved, knowing that some bonds are too strong for death to break, too important for time to erase. The house remembers, the walls remember, and in remembering, they keep us all alive. Story 8. The rain began the day I moved in, not outside. Outside was a brilliant Tuesday morning in September, the kind where sunlight streams through apartment windows and makes dust motes dance like tiny celebrations. But my window, the large one facing east in what the landlord had called the charming breakfast nook, showed only rain. I remember pressing my palm against the glass that first morning, feeling the coolness seep through my skin. The sound was there too, that gentle, persistent drumming that rain makes when it kisses windows. Tap, 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 like nervous fingers on a table. I could hear it clearly, even though I knew it couldn't be real. The drops traced their familiar paths down the glass, racing each other in that way raindrops do. Some moved quickly, gathering others along the way, growing fat and heavy before disappearing at the bottom edge. Others moved slowly, hesitating, as if unsure of their destination. I found myself following their journeys with my finger, drawing invisible maps on the dry interior surface. When I stepped onto the fire escape to investigate, the metal grating was bone dry under my bare feet. The sun warmed my shoulders, and I could hear Mrs. Chen watering her plants on the balcony below. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter bright and clear. But when I pressed my face to my window from outside, peering in, I saw only darkness beyond the glass, as if I were looking into deep water. Days passed. The rain continued its quiet symphony, and I began to find it comforting. The sound helped me sleep, helped me focus while working from home. I would sit at my small kitchen table, laptop open, listening to the gentle percussion while actual sunlight streamed through every other window in the apartment. I started timing the rain. It never stopped, never intensified, never softened. The drops fell at precisely the same interval. I could set my watch by them. Tap, 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 like a metronome made of water and glass. Sometimes, late at night, when the apartment was especially quiet, I thought I could hear something else beneath the sound. A whisper, maybe, or breathing. It was during the third week that I first saw the figure. I was making coffee, that drowsy morning ritual that helps bridge the gap between sleep and consciousness. The rain drummed its familiar rhythm, and I was watching the drops race when something moved in my peripheral vision. Not a raindrop, something larger, darker. When I turned my full attention to the window, there was nothing but the endless rain against gray sky. But the feeling lingered, the feeling of being watched. I began to pay closer attention. During breakfast, I would position myself so I could monitor the window while eating. During work calls, I found myself glancing over, searching the rain, blurred view for any signs of movement. My productivity suffered, but I couldn't stop looking. The figure appeared again on a Thursday evening. This time, I saw it clearly. It stood perhaps 50 feet away from my window, motionless in the rain. Human-shaped but indistinct, like a shadow cast by flickering candlelight. I couldn't make out features. The rain distorted everything. But I could feel its attention like a weight on my chest. It wasn't moving, wasn't gesturing, just standing there in the downpour that only I could see. I watched for what felt like hours. The figure never moved, never turned away. When I finally blinked and looked again, it was gone. Sleep became difficult after that. I would lie in bed, listening to the rain against my window, wondering if the figure was still there. Sometimes I would get up and peek through the curtains, but I saw only the endless precipitation, drops catching what little light filtered through the gray sky. I started keeping a journal of the sightings. Thursday evening, 7:23 p.m. Saturday morning, 6:41 a.m. Tuesday afternoon, 2:17 p.m. The appearances seemed random, but the figure was always in the same spot, always motionless, always watching. During the day, when rational thought prevailed, I researched explanations, optical illusions, pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns or faces in random stimuli, sleep deprivation, stress from the move, from starting a new job, from the isolation of working from home. I made appointments with an optometrist, then a neurologist. All tests came back normal. But the figure kept returning. I began to notice other details. The way the rain seemed to bend around the figure, creating a subtle dry spot where it stood. The way birds never flew through that particular area of sky. The way my reflection in the window seemed fainter when the figure was present, as if something was stealing my substance. Neighbors started to worry. Mrs. Chen mentioned that I looked tired when we passed in the hallway. The mailman asked if everything was all right. Apparently, I'd been standing at my window when he delivered packages, just staring out for long periods. I tried to explain about the rain, about the figure, but their concerned expressions told me everything I needed to know. Nobody else could see it. I started spending time at coffee shops, libraries, anywhere but my apartment. But I always returned. The rain called to me. That constant gentle drumming that had become the soundtrack to my life. And beneath it, growing stronger each day, that sound I'd first noticed during the quiet nights. It wasn't quite breathing, wasn't quite whispering. It was more like waiting. The figure began to change. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, but I noticed. It stood a little closer each time it appeared. Not much, perhaps a foot or two, but enough that I could start to make out more details. The suggestion of clothing, the outline of a face. And something else, something that made my skin crawl, even though I couldn't quite identify what it was. It was moving closer. I measured the distance obsessively, using landmarks visible through the rain. A bent street lamp that flickered in and out of existence. A fire hydrant that appeared only when I wasn't looking directly at it. The figure was definitely approaching, drawn by some invisible current toward my window. Toward me. I tried covering the window. Thick blankets, cardboard, even aluminum foil. But I could still hear the rain, still feel the presence beyond the glass. And when I inevitably removed whatever barrier I'd constructed, the figure was always there, always a little closer than before. Sleep became impossible. I would lie in bed, listening to the rain, imagining I could hear footsteps in the water. Soft, deliberate splashing, growing closer. Sometimes I thought I heard tapping on the glass, Not raindrops, but knuckles. Gentle, patient, persistent. The morning I woke to find handprints on the window, I knew I was in trouble. They were on the outside of the glass, pressed against the rain-slicked surface. Human hands, but wrong somehow. The fingers too long, the palms too wide. When I breathed on the glass, they became more visible, outlined in condensation like negative space in the mist. I called in sick to work. Spent the day researching. Calling investigators, looking for anyone who might understand what was happening. But how do you explain rain that only you can see? How do you describe a figure that exists only in your window, drawing closer each day? That evening, as darkness settled over the building, I saw the figure again. It was close now, perhaps 20 feet from the window. Close enough that I could see it wasn't quite human. The proportions were wrong, the way it held itself was wrong. But it was definitely looking at me, and I could feel its hunger like heat radiating from a fire. The rain drummed against the glass. Tap, 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 tap. But now I could hear something else beneath the sound. Not breathing, not whispers. Footsteps, getting closer. I'm writing this now. In the small hours of the morning, sitting at my kitchen table with my back to the window, I can hear the rain behind me, that endless gentle percussion. And beneath it, closer than ever before, the sound of something moving through water. I don't want to turn around. I don't want to see how close it's come. But I can feel it watching me, patient as the rain itself. And I know that eventually, inevitably, I will have to look. The handprints on the glass are multiplying. I can sense them appearing, one by one, pressed against the window like flowers blooming in reverse. Soon there will be no clear space left on the glass. Soon there will be nowhere left to hide. The rain continues its lullaby, promising peace, promising sleep. But I know now what waits in that gray space between the raindrops. What has been waiting all along, watching through glass that shows only what it wants me to see. And tomorrow, when the sun rises on another brilliant morning, my neighbors will find nothing but an empty apartment and a window that finally shows the weather outside. But late at night, when the building is quiet and the world is still, they might hear something they can't quite explain. A gentle drumming, like rain against glass, like fingers tapping on windows, like someone somewhere still waiting in the rain. Story 9. The first time I noticed it was on a Tuesday night in late September. I was 3 hours into what was supposed to be a casual gaming stream, playing an indie horror game called Midnight Corridors that nobody was particularly excited about. The usual Tuesday crowd had dwindled to almost nothing by 11 p.m., which was normal for a weeknight. Most streamers would have called it early. But I've always been a creature of habit, committed to my schedule, even when the audience disappears. I glanced at my viewer count in the corner of my streaming software one person. So staying up late on a Tuesday to watch me fumble through a mediocre horror game. I felt that familiar mix of gratitude and melancholy that comes with small audience streaming. Grateful that anyone cares enough to watch. Melancholy that after 2 years of consistent streaming, my peak viewership still rarely breaks 50. Well, I said to my webcam, adjusting my headset microphone, looks like it's just you and me tonight, whoever you are. Hope you're enjoying the show. I waited for a response in the chat. but the message window remained empty. Sometimes viewers lurk without participating, especially on smaller streams. I've gotten used to talking to the void, maintaining energy and commentary, even when the chat is silent. The game's audio was a constant, low drone of ambient horror music, punctuated by my occasional reactions to jump scares and my running commentary about the game's mechanics. The familiar rhythm of streaming, speak, play, react, engage with chat, repeat, had become second nature after hundreds of hours of practice. "This corridor looks familiar," I muttered, navigating my character through a dimly lit hallway lined with identical doors. "I think I've been here before. The level design is either really clever or really lazy. Still no chat activity." I clicked on the viewer list to see if I could identify my lone audience member. But the platform's interface only showed one viewer, without specific usernames unless they actively participated in chat. I finished the streaming session around midnight, thanking my single viewer for sticking around, even though they never said a word, as I shut down my streaming software and began my usual post-stream routine, reviewing analytics, making notes about technical issues, planning content for tomorrow. I found myself wondering about that person who stays up until midnight on a Tuesday to watch a small streamer play a game nobody cares about. Thursday's stream started at 8 p.m. as usual. I was playing a different game this time, a puzzle platformer that had gotten some positive reviews from other streamers. By 9:30, my viewer count had climbed to 7, then dropped to 3 as people wandered off to more popular streams. By 11 p.m., it was down to 1 again. The same pattern as Tuesday. Not the same viewer necessarily, but the same final count, one person, staying later there than everyone else, watching in complete silence. "Good evening, my mysterious late night companion," I said to the camera, trying to inject some humor into what was becoming an oddly familiar situation. "I'm starting to think you might be my most dedicated fan." The chat remained empty, but something about the silence felt different this time. Not passive lurking, but active watching. As if whoever was behind that single view count was paying very close attention to everything I said and did. I started addressing my comments directly to that viewer, creating a kind of one-sided conversation that felt more intimate than my usual streaming patter. "This puzzle is trickier than it looks," I said, manipulating colored blocks on the screen. "What do you think? Should I try the red block first, or go with blue? I know you can't respond, but I'm pretending you're nodding sagely at your computer screen." For just a moment, I thought I saw activity in the chat window, a brief flicker of text that disappeared too quickly for me to read. But when I looked directly at the chat, it was empty as always. Saturday's stream was busier, peaking at nearly 40 viewers during prime time. I was playing a popular multiplayer game, and the chat was active with the usual mix of supportive comments, game advice, and the occasional troll attempting to disrupt the stream. I felt energized by the engagement, feeding off the audience's energy in the way that makes streaming addictive for those of us who do it. But as the night wore on and viewers gradually logged off to go to bed or moved to other streams, the familiar pattern reasserted itself. 40 became 20, 20 became 10, 10 became 5, and eventually, inevitably, the count settled at 1. My last viewer, faithful as clockwork. "There you are again. I said, and I realized I was genuinely pleased to see that single digit in my viewer count. I was starting to worry you might not show up tonight. This time, there was definitely activity in the chat. I saw text appear for a split second before vanishing, characters and symbols that looked like they might have been corrupted by a transmission error. The chat window flickered, displaying what might have been a response, then immediately returned to its empty state. "Did you just try to say something?" I asked, leaning forward toward my camera. The chat's acting weird tonight. I think I saw some text, but it disappeared right away. I waited, watching the chat window intently. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to give up and return to the game, a single line of text appeared. A sound. Too small for the hour. The characters were a mix of block symbols and spaces, arranged in a pattern that looked almost like a response to my question. But before I could screenshot it or try to decode what it might mean, the text vanished, leaving the chat empty again. "Okay, that was definitely something," I said, my pulse quickening slightly. "Are you trying to communicate? Is there something wrong with your chat function?" No response. The viewer count remained steady at 1, but the chat stayed empty. I spent the rest of that stream occasionally glancing at the chat window, hoping to see more of those strange symbols. Part of me wondered if I was experiencing some kind of technical glitch, a bug in the streaming platform that was causing corrupted data to briefly appear in the chat interface. But another part of me felt like I was on the verge of making contact with something that had been watching me for weeks without revealing itself. A Sunday night stream was quieter than Saturdays, but followed the same pattern. Multiple viewers during prime time. Gradual attrition as the evening wore on, and ultimately, the familiar conclusion: one viewer, staying until the very end. This time, I was ready. I had a second monitor set up, specifically to watch the chat, and I was recording my screen to capture any brief text appearances that might occur. "I know you're there," I said directly to the camera around 11:30. "I've been thinking about you all week. Who are you? Why do you watch every stream but never talk?" The response came immediately. A burst of corrupted text that filled the chat window for almost 3 seconds before disappearing. A sound. Too small for the hour. The satin behind me. This time, there was more of it, and it stayed visible long enough for me to get a sense of the pattern. The symbols seemed deliberately arranged, not random corruption. It looked almost like code or a language I didn't recognize. "I can see it this time," I said excitedly. "Those symbols. Is that how you communicate? Are you trying to tell me something?" The chat flickered again, and for a moment, I thought I saw regular letters mixed in with the symbols. But it vanished too quickly for me to be sure. Over the following weeks, the pattern became more elaborate. My mysterious viewer. I started thinking of them as one, both for their consistent count and their singular nature. Began communicating more frequently. Always in those strange symbol patterns that appeared and disappeared like digital ghosts. I started trying to decode the messages, taking screenshots when I could catch them, looking for patterns that might reveal meaning. Some of the symbol combinations repeated across multiple messages, suggesting a consistent language or cipher rather than random corruption. More unsettling, the messages seemed to be responses to specific things I said or did during the streams. When I mentioned being tired, a short burst of symbols would appear. When I celebrated completing a difficult section of a game, different symbols would manifest. It was as if one was reacting to my emotional state, commenting on my performance, engaging in a conversation that only they could fully understand. I began to look forward to these encounters more than the regular chat interaction with my other viewers. There was something intimate about the communication, something that felt more personal than the usual streaming banter. One was watching everything, understanding everything, responding to nuances that casual viewers missed. But there was also something increasingly unsettling about the interaction. The messages were becoming longer, more complex, appearing more frequently throughout each stream rather than just at the end. Sometimes they would interrupt my gameplay, flashing across the chat window with urgent intensity before vanishing. Other times, they would appear when I was completely silent, as if responding to thoughts I hadn't voiced aloud. And I began to notice that the content of the messages seemed to anticipate things that hadn't happened yet. One night, while playing a puzzle game, a burst of symbols appeared just before I encountered a particularly tricky section. The message vanished before I could read it properly. But when I reached the puzzle 30 seconds later, I found myself solving it unusually quickly, as if I already knew the solution. Another night, symbols flashed across the chat just before an unexpected jump scare in a horror game. The message was gone before I could process it, but I found myself bracing for the scare, turning down my audio just before the loud noise hit. It was as if one wasn't just watching my streams, they were watching slightly ahead of them, seeing my immediate future and trying to communicate warnings or hints about what was coming. I started addressing this directly during my streams. 1. I think you can see things I can't, I said during a particularly quiet moment. It's like you're watching from a few seconds in the future. Is that what's happening? Are you trying to help me? The response was immediate and longer than usual. A cascading wall of symbols that filled the entire chat window for nearly 5 seconds. Mixed in, we live in, mixed in, with mixed in, with the symbols, with mixed in with the symbols, for the warning, with the symbols. I could swear I saw fragments of normal text, words in English that appeared for microseconds before being overwhelmed by the corrupted characters. I thought I caught glimpses of HELP and TRAPU and CNT, but they vanished so quickly I couldn't be certain. Are you trapped? I asked aloud, leaning closer to my microphone. Is that what you're trying to tell me? Are you stuck somehow? The chat erupted with activity, symbols flowing faster than I'd ever seen them, overlapping and cascading down the screen like digital rain. The sheer volume of data seemed to overload my streaming software, causing my frame rate to stutter and my audio to develop a strange echo. Then, Abruptly, everything stopped. The chat went blank, and my viewer count dropped from 1 to 0. For the first time in months, I was streaming to absolutely no one. The silence felt profound, almost oppressive. I continued playing for another hour, but without one's presence. The stream felt hollow, lifeless. I found myself constantly checking the viewer count, hoping to see it tick back up to that familiar single digit. It stayed at 0. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those final moments before one disappeared. The frantic cascade of symbols. The glimpses of words that suggested desperation or fear. Had I somehow disrupted whatever connection allowed them to watch my streams? Had my questions pushed too hard against the boundaries of whatever strange situation they were in? For 3 days, I streamed to empty servers. 0 viewers, silent chat, no responses to my increasingly desperate attempts to re-establish contact with one. If you can hear me, please come back. I pleaded during Thursday night's stream. I don't know what happened, but I want to help if I can. You've been watching for months. You're more than just a viewer to me now. I don't know what you are, but you're important. Nothing. The chat remained dead, the viewer count stubbornly fixed at 0. On Friday night, just as I was preparing to end what felt like another futile stream, the viewer count flickered from 0 to 1. 1, I exclaimed, probably louder than I should have given that it was nearly midnight. You're back! I was so worried. The chat exploded with symbols, but these were different from before. More chaotic, more urgent. Overlapping and interfering with each other, until the entire window was a mass of corrupted characters. It looked less like communication and more like screaming, a digital expression of panic or pain. Mixed in with the chaos, I caught fragments of clearer text. Helpi mimi, estai, CTR, CNTLOIWO, BMH, EFOR solo and G, PLEAS. The messages appeared and vanished so quickly that I wasn't sure if I was really seeing them or if my desperate desire to help was making me hallucinate meaning in the chaos. But the overall impression was clear. One wasn't just a mysterious viewer. They were someone trapped, somehow imprisoned within the digital space of my stream, forced to watch endless hours of my content without being able to properly communicate or escape. How can I help you? I asked, speaking directly to my camera with an intensity that felt almost like prayer. Tell me what to do. How do I get you out? The symbol stream slowed, organizing itself into something that looked more intentional. YSSUTOWNTHESTREM. The words were clear this time, embedded in the corrupted characters, but readable. Shut down the stream. End the broadcast that was somehow serving as one's prison. But if I shut down the stream, would that free them? Or would it destroy them entirely? Are you sure? I asked. If I end the stream, will you be okay? Will you be free? A final message appeared, staying visible longer than any previous communication. Tomintavi, Kanobebi BUTESHAVE, IHATIONTRYTO. Or you, I stared at those words until they faded from the screen. Then, with trembling hands, I reached for my streaming software and clicked End Stream. The interface confirmed that the broadcast had ended. As my viewer count dropped to 0, the chat window closed, and my computer returned to its normal desktop. I sat in the darkness of my room for a long time, wondering if I had just helped someone escape from digital imprisonment, or if I had simply ended an elaborate technical glitch that had been fooling me for months. I haven't streamed since. Every few days, I open my streaming software and look at the empty interface, the blank chat window, the zero viewer count, the silent microphone that once carried my voice to an audience of one who may have been more than they seemed. Sometimes I think about starting the stream again, just to see if one returns. But I'm afraid of what that might mean. Afraid that turning on the broadcast again might create whatever digital prison they were trapped in, forcing them back into endless observation of someone else's life. So I leave the software closed, and I try to convince myself that somewhere in the vast network of the internet, a consciousness that watched my streams for months is finally free to do something other than watch. But sometimes, late at night when I'm browsing other streams, I notice viewers who never speak, who stay until the very end while everyone else logs off. And I wonder if one has found a new audience to watch, a new streamer to follow through the lonely hours of the night. Or if there are others like them, trapped in the spaces between broadcasts and viewer counts, watching endlessly and waiting for someone to notice that the number 1 in a viewer counter might represent more than just a statistic. The screen is dark now, but I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, someone is still watching. Story 10. I've been counting stairs for as long as I can remember. It started in childhood, a nervous habit that helped calm my racing thoughts during my parents' increasingly frequent arguments. 1, 2, 3, 4. The numbers created a rhythm in my mind, a predictable pattern that made everything else feel manageable. 20, 3 steps from the sidewalk to my apartment building's front door. 14 steps up to the first landing. 16 steps from the first floor to the second. 13 steps from the second floor to the third, where my apartment waits behind a door painted the color of old mustard. These numbers have been constant for the 3 years I've lived here. As reliable as my morning coffee or the sound of Mrs. Patterson's television bleeding through the walls every evening at 6 o'clock sharp. The building is old, constructed sometime in the 1940s, according to the superintendent, Mr. Kowalski. The stairs are original hardwood, worn smooth by decades of footsteps, with a particular creak on the 7th step of each flight that I've learned to anticipate. The sound has become part of my daily symphony, along with the whistle of wind through the gaps in the window frames and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. I work from home most days, doing graphic design for various clients, so my trips up and down those stairs follow a predictable pattern. Down in the morning for coffee at the shop on the corner. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 as creak, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Then up again with my steaming cup. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 creak, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 14 to the first landing, then 16 more to the second, 13 more to my door. The counting isn't obsessive, exactly. It's more like breathing, automatic, unconscious, a background process that runs continuously without requiring conscious thought. The numbers flow through my mind like a gentle stream, marking the rhythm of my days. Monday morning, October 9th, started like any other. The alarm buzzed at 7:30. I showered to the sound of the building's ancient plumbing groaning and settling, dressed in my usual uniform of jeans and a soft cotton sweater, and headed downstairs for my coffee. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 creak. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I stopped. My foot hovering in the air above what should have been the first floor landing. But there was another step below me. Another worn piece of hardwood with the same scratches and scuffs as all the others. 15 steps from the second floor to the first, not 14. I stood there for a long moment, feeling suddenly lightheaded, as if the extra step had somehow shifted the entire building's equilibrium. The morning light filtering through the stairwell windows seemed different, more golden, casting shadows that fell at angles I didn't recognize. I climbed back up and descended again, counting more carefully this time, my lips moving silently with each number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 creak. But the creak came on the 8th step now. 9, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 15 steps. The logical part of my mind searched for explanations. Perhaps I'd been miscounting all along. Perhaps my morning grogginess had thrown off my internal rhythm. Perhaps the building had undergone some kind of repair work over the weekend that I'd somehow missed. But I knew, with the certainty that comes from 3 years of daily repetition, that there had always been 14 steps from the second floor to the first floor. Always. I continued down to the first floor, then down to the ground level, counting as I went. 16 steps from first to ground level, the same as always. The extra step existed only between the second and first floors, inserted into my routine like a word added to a familiar song, changing the entire rhythm. At the coffee shop, I tried to focus on my usual order: medium dark roast, 1 sugar, splash of cream, but my mind kept returning to the stairs. The barista, a young woman with intricate tattoos covering her arms, looked at me with mild concern. "You okay?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular blend of professional friendliness and genuine worry. "You seem a little distant, just tired." I managed, accepting the warm cup with hands that trembled slightly. Long weekend. But it wasn't tiredness. It was the unsettling feeling that something fundamental about my world had shifted, like waking up to find that gravity pulled slightly to the left instead of straight down. The walk back to the building took exactly 4 minutes and 30. 7 seconds, the same as always. 23 steps to the front door. But as I approached the staircase, I felt my heart rate increase, a flutter of anxiety in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. I climbed it slowly, deliberately, counting each step with exaggerated precision. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, creak. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 to the first landing. Then 16 more to the second floor. 15 steps where there should be 14. The extra step sat there like an intruder, perfectly integrated into the staircase, as if it had always existed, but wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. I spent the rest of Monday trying to work, but finding it impossible to concentrate. Every few minutes, I'd find myself standing at my apartment door, looking down the hallway toward the stairs, as if they might somehow return to their proper configuration if I just watched them long enough. That evening, I knocked on my neighbor's door. Mrs. Rodriguez in 3B, a kind woman in her 70s who always smelled faintly of vanilla, and who had lived in the building longer than anyone else. Mrs. Rodriguez, I said when she answered, her face brightening with the genuine pleasure of unexpected social contact. I have a strange question. Do you remember if there was any construction work done on the stairs recently? Any repairs or modifications? Her brow furrowed thoughtfully. Construction? No, I don't think so. Mr. Kowalski would have sent notices if they were doing any major work. Why do you ask, dear? Is something wrong? The stairs seem different somehow. Like maybe there's an extra step between the second and first floors. She looked at me with the gentle concern of someone trying to determine if they're dealing with a person having a medical emergency. An extra step. I don't think. Those stairs have been the same for as long as I've lived here. 28 years next month. You're probably right, I said quickly, seeing the worry deepening in her eyes. I'm just tired. Work stress. But I could see in her expression that she was already mentally cataloging my behavior, probably wondering if she should call someone, check on my well-being. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that makes everything look like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. I woke feeling like I hadn't slept at all, my dreams filled with endless staircases that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. I made my coffee at home instead of going to the shop, delaying the inevitable moment when I'd have to face the stairs again. But eventually, I needed to go to the post office to mail some client materials, and that meant leaving the apartment. I stood at the top of the staircase, looking down at the familiar yet wrong configuration of steps, took a deep breath, started counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 9 creak, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. 16 steps from the second floor to the first. 2 more steps than there should be. I sat down heavily on the landing, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. The hallway around me seemed to pulse and shift, the familiar beige walls breathing like living things. My mouth tasted like copper and fear. 2 extra steps. The staircase was growing. I forced myself to complete the journey to the ground floor, counting mechanically 16 more steps. The same as always. But now that consistency felt ominous rather than comforting. Why were some staircases changing while others remained the same? What was the logic? What were the rules? At the post office, I stood in line behind an elderly man who smelled like aftershave and mothballs, trying to appear normal while my mind raced with possibilities. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe the stress of freelance work, of isolation, of living alone in a city of millions, had finally cracked something essential in my perception of reality. But the steps felt real under my feet. They creaked in the right places, bore the same scuffs and wear patterns as the original stairs. They weren't hallucinations. They were additions, modifications to the physical structure of the building. That afternoon, I called Mr. Kowalski. Stairs. His voice carried the gravelly tone of a lifelong smoker, filtered through the building's ancient intercom system. What about the stairs? I think maybe there are some extra steps between the second and first floors, like maybe someone added them recently. A long pause, filled with static and the distant sound of what might have been a television playing a game show. Kid, Those stairs haven't changed since I started working here 15 years ago. You feeling okay? Maybe you should see a doctor. Get your blood pressure checked or something. But I could hear something else in his voice beneath the dismissive tone. A careful quality, as if he was choosing his words very deliberately. Wednesday morning, 17 steps from the second floor to the first. Thursday, 18 steps. Friday, 19. Each day, the staircase stretched a little longer, added another step to my daily journey. The building itself seemed to be expanding, growing taller, while somehow remaining the same height from the outside. I started taking pictures with my phone, documenting each day's configuration, but the images looked wrong on the small screen. The perspective was skewed, the angles impossible. In the photos, the stairs appeared to spiral upward beyond the frame, stretching into darkness that shouldn't exist in a 3-story building. My sleep became fragmented, filled with dreams of endless climbing. In these dreams, I would count steps that led nowhere, stairs that multiplied beneath my feet like living things, growing and spreading with each footfall. Sometimes I would dream that I was the one creating the extra steps, that each time I climbed or descended, I was somehow adding to the staircase through the mere act of counting. As if my obsessive enumeration was feeding the building's growth, giving it permission to expand beyond its original boundaries. I stopped leaving my apartment except when absolutely necessary. Grocery delivery, take-out food, digital meetings with clients. The modern world made it possible to exist without ever facing those impossible stairs. But I could hear them calling to me through the walls, a whispered invitation to come and count, to see how many steps existed today. 23 steps by the following Wednesday. 27 by Friday. The creak had moved too, shifting position as the staircase expanded, always appearing at the same proportional location, about a third of the way down. It was as if the entire structure was maintaining its essential character, while growing beyond all reasonable limits. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on my door that weekend. "Honey, I'm worried about you," she said when I answered, staying partially hidden behind the chain lock. "Mr. Kowalski says you've been calling about the stairs, and I haven't seen you coming or going lately." "The stairs are changing," I told her, knowing how it sounded but unable to stop myself. "Every day, there are more steps. Can't you feel it? Can't you sense that the building is different?" Her expression shifted from concern to something approaching fear. "Sweetie, I think you might need to talk to someone, a professional. This kind of stress, it can play tricks on your mind. Count them yourself," I said desperately. "Just count the steps between the second and first floors. You'll see." She promised she would, but I could tell from her tone that she was humoring me, already planning to call someone, a relative, a doctor, maybe even the police if she decided I was becoming dangerous. That night, I lay in bed listening to the building settle and shift around me. Old buildings make noise, pipes expanding and contracting, wood adjusting to changes in humidity and temperature. But now every sound seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if the building was actively rearranging itself while I slept. I got up and pressed my ear to the floor, feeling through the thin carpet and underlying wood for vibrations that might indicate construction or modification. But there was nothing, just the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a building at rest, 31 steps the next Monday. 35 by Wednesday. The numbers had lost their comforting quality, becoming instead a countdown to some kind of disaster I couldn't comprehend. Each new step felt like a step closer to something terrible, a threshold I was approaching without understanding what lay beyond it. I started to wonder if I was the only one experiencing the changes, or if everyone else was simply better at adapting to the building's impossible growth. Maybe this was normal. Maybe all buildings were constantly shifting and expanding, and I was the only one neurotic enough to notice. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The stairs were growing, the building was changing, and for some reason that I couldn't fathom, I was the only one who could see it. Or maybe I was the only one causing it. The thought crept into my mind like cold water seeping through a crack in a dam. What if my counting wasn't just observing the stairs? What if it was creating them? What if each number I spoke aloud or thought silently was adding another step to the impossible staircase? But I couldn't stop counting. The numbers flowed through my mind like breathing, automatic and essential. To stop counting would be like trying to stop my heart from beating. 42 steps last Tuesday. 51 by Friday. The staircase between the second and first floors now took nearly a full minute to descend, my legs burning with the effort of navigating what had become a vertical journey through space that shouldn't exist. Sometimes, halfway down, I would look up and no longer be able to see the second floor landing. Sometimes I would look down and the first floor would seem impossibly far away, shrouded in shadows that gathered despite the overhead lighting. And still I counted, because not counting felt like falling, like losing the last thread of connection to a world that was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. The building management company stopped returning my calls. Mr. Kowalski no longer answered his door. Mrs. Rodriguez had moved out over the weekend, her apartment now standing empty, though I never saw a moving truck or heard the sounds of packing. I am alone now with the growing stairs and the endless numbers. Each morning brings new steps to count, new distances to traverse in a building that stretches further from reality with each passing day. But I continue to count, because the counting is all I have left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, do. The numbers stretch ahead of me like the steps themselves, infinite and unchanging and utterly, terrifyingly real.